Welcome, wrestling fans, to the Pro Wrestle Machine. Whether you're tuning in from the Great American Bash or halfway around the world, we've got a jam-packed episode for you. Get ready to dive into wrestling's rich history, packed with insights, opinions, and a few surprises. And remember, you can skip to your favorite moments with our chapter markers. Let's jump right into it. August 28, 2000 Wrestling Observer Newsletter, Hall of Fame issue, by Dave Meltzer. In our largest one-year inclusion in history, 7 new members were named to the Wrestling Observer Newsletter Pro Wrestling Hall of Fame in a balloting of performers, front office people, reports, historians, and some well-known wrestling experts. 4 of the newcomers were voted on by the largest voting panel to date, and 3 others were chosen largely by lobbying from historians providing research as to why they clearly belonged. Voted in were 2 wrestlers who have come very close in recent elections, Mick Foley, who came 3 votes shy last year, and Shinya Hashimoto, who came 1 vote shy last year, along with 2 others voted in on their first eligible ballot, Steve Austin, and in something of a mild surprise, Akira Hokuto. Foley, who already had strong credentials last year, only added to his resume over the past 12 months. He had 2 classic matches with Hunter Hearst Helmsley on 2 WWF PPVs that drew big buy rates on what amounted to his farewell run, including a classic interview. Granted, some of it was spoiled by coming back 3 weeks later, but this is still pro wrestling and romantic endings just don't happen. And writing an autobiography which not only became the best nationally distributed book on pro wrestling of this generation, but hit #1 on the bestsellers list, as well as starring in a documentary on wrestling which had generally strong reviews and was under consideration for an Oscar nomination. Hashimoto was another who had the credentials 1 year ago, with his record of main eventing many of the biggest dates in the history of pro wrestling. Hashimoto only wrestled a handful of matches over the past year, all but 1 on dome shows, which drew well, but his feud with Naoya Ogawa in those matches has become one of the more memorable feuds of the modern era, and its most recent encounter, in which Hashimoto, like Foley, lost a retirement match. Although Foley came back, he really isn't going to wrestle much if at all in the future, while Hashimoto is expected back soon, which drew the largest TV audience of any pro wrestling match in many years. If anything, Austin, in his first year eligible, is only shocking because he didn't draw the highest percentage of those making it, since he figured to be the strongest candidate not only on the ballot, but the strongest candidate since we started doing balloting. If anything, it was a surprise that Austin's percentage didn't challenge the record 95% put on the board last year by Jushin Liger, but apparently the longevity at the top factor worked against him, because more than any other wrestler, Austin is the one who was the key in the WWF's turnaround in 3 years, from being a company losing millions every year, to a company that is more profitable in 1 year than perhaps any other wrestling company has been in its entire history. No wrestler in history ever sold merchandise like Austin or drew the money he did, and even if he wasn't a strong performer in the ring, a category he doesn't fit into at all, those are credentials pretty hard to argue with. Hokuto, something of a surprise in her first year on the ballot, is still a strong choice. Hokuto would certainly have to rank high, perhaps as high as number 2, on any list of the greatest in-ring performers ever in the world of women's wrestling. Hokuto's career is actually similar to Austin's, right down to the neck injury that should have ended her career before she had her big run, but instead she came back to be one of the biggest stars as well as best psychological workers that women's wrestling ever produced. In addition, we are recognizing Bill Longson, Shandor Sabo, and Frank Sexton, 3 major world champions from the 1940s who, because wrestling has little in the way of a true recorded history, were overlooked in the past but from their credentials, clearly belong. Longson, generally considered the first true heel to hold the world heavyweight title, was a tremendous drawing card, particularly in St. Louis, where he was a main event fixture for decades. Sabo was a superstar on the West Coast for 2 decades who held 5 different versions of the world title in the 40s. Sexton held the old AWA world title, which many at the time considered the strongest title in the game, for almost 5 years, and during that period faced every other major world champion in unification matches. We sent out 135 ballots to a combination of past and current wrestling greats, longtime historians, current reports, and other experts around the world. We received 113 responses, by far our largest to date. The balloting is broken down according to region, with 60% of the vote from a particular region needed for entrance. This is done somewhat along the lines of the Major League Baseball Hall of Fame, which seems to be the most seriously taken Hall of Fame in sports. Baseball requires 70% for inclusion, but that figure, because of the nature of pro wrestling, seems exceedingly difficult to achieve, although all 4 that were voted in this year did top that mark. In the balloting, voters were asked to vote on inclusion based on many factors, including drawing power, ring performance, and being an historically important figure in the industry. Longevity should be a prime consideration rather than simply a 2 or 3 year hot run, unless someone is so historically significant as a trendsetter or in changing the course of the industry in some form that they shouldn't be ignored. Voters were allowed to vote for up to 10 performers. Non-performers could be voted on without the votes counting against the 10 maximum. There was no minimum number of candidates that had to be picked. Eligibility was based on candidates either being 35 years old or being in their 15th year as an active competitor. The idea of breaking down voting by regions is meant to be fair to all 3 major wrestling regions, as most are not familiar enough with performers who spent the majority of their career in different regions than they either appeared or followed. We ended up with 99 ballots including US and Canadian names, 76 with Japanese names and 55 from Mexico. The only flaw in the system this year may have been Gran Hamada. Hamada has wrestled in recent years in Japan and is of Japanese descent, but spent the majority of his career as a top star in Mexico. By his being considered Mexican, while it may have given him an edge since he came very close to making it, his votes from Japan made it more difficult somewhat for other Mexicans to make it, although under any standard, none would have this year. Last year, because Jushin Liger was such a strong candidate, garnering so many votes of people who normally wouldn't vote for a Japanese wrestler, it was the difference in keeping Hashimoto, who fell 1 vote shy last year. A lot of people felt his inclusion on the first ballot was a given. All responses, due to the political nature of the business, have been promised to be kept confidential, except my own, which were detailed in the Observer 2 weeks ago. The balloting was interesting and probably the toughest year to date, particularly when noting the list of those who didn't even get 10% of the vote and are thus ineligible for a minimum of 2 years. Lou Albano, Chavo Guerrero, Konnan, and Ken Shamrock all ranged between 25% and 30% of the vote last year, so while not threatened to make it, all got significant response. Since Albano has long since retired as a full-time manager, and Guerrero rarely wrestles with his glory days being long past, it seems new voters as well as many voters who voted for them in the past didn't this year. Chono debuted on the ballot last year, barely got the 10% necessary to be back on, and had a bad year, so his dropping was hardly a surprise. Funaki, Rutan and Sabu were all first-timers, and between Funaki and Rutan's lack of drawing votes combined with the drop of Ken Shamrock all the way from 29% to below 10% indicates the same thing I had figured, that people find the pioneers of shooting pro wrestling, since they were the 3 biggest stars from the Pancrase organization when it was promoted and publicized as pro wrestling, but the vast majority of the matches were real, are not considered to be important figures in pro wrestling. The next test would be in 2004 when Kiyoshi Tamura becomes eligible, being that he did very well in shoot matches, but inside the ring was one of the 3 or 4 best performers of this period. Kazushi Sakuraba, whose credentials in shoot are impeccable but wouldn't be under consideration for his non-shoot work whatsoever, will also become eligible that year. Volkan of Rings, who has similar credentials as far as works as Tamura, but not the credentials in shoots at least within the pro wrestling world, remained at about the same 20% level he's maintained the past 3 elections. Konnan was considered a strong future candidate when he left Mexico, but his stay in the United States has made people take him totally out of consideration. Sabu, who was a pioneer of many style changes and considered the top star in ECW for several years, still garnered little voting interest. No doubt the most controversial result will be Michaels, who came just 1 vote shy of inclusion last year and fell to 7 votes shy this year. In breaking down the results by category, Michaels did not fare particularly well except among people who don't work in pro wrestling. Among current and past promoters, he fared poorly, 25%. Among current active top star wrestlers, he did good enough to make it but not overwhelmingly so, right at 60%. Among current reporters, he was right at a 50-50 proposition, almost identical with his final total. He did most poorly among wrestling historians, 13%, retired wrestling legends, 10%, and fared his best among a category I'd call miscellaneous current wrestling experts, 80%, that don't quite fit into any specific category. Still, with no new candidates looking to debut on the ballot next year, Michaels looks on paper to be the strongest candidate in what would be a much easier election. The next entrances of strong candidates is 2002 with Ultimo Dragon, Kenta Kobashi, and Manami Toyota. Also gaining strong response, but not enough to make it, was grouping Michael Hayes, Terry Gordy, and Buddy Roberts as the Fabulous Freebirds, who were huge attractions in the early 80s in Mid-South, Georgia and Texas. Hayes and Gordy as individuals both garnered fairly decent response 2 years ago, and lesser response last year, but it was clear as individuals they were never going to make it. There was significant interest in them as the Freebird group, and next year, when the competition doesn't figure to be as tough, they have a chance. Finished slightly higher than in the previous two polls. He appears to be a career borderline pick. Lismark has gotten strong response every year, and this was actually his strongest. Nakano was slightly down from last year, and my feeling on her is that because of the lack of visibility among women's wrestling, or at least women's wrestling with women that are great workers, on today's scene, that are exploits similar to Shamrock and Pancrase, yet forgotten, and she may fade like a Dick Murdoch in the future. Ventura is an interesting pick because his credentials are unique, but apparently not enough to really challenge for inclusion. Backlund went up from 16 to 28%, I'd bet largely on the article showing how successful he was as a draw in Madison Square Garden, but even that credential didn't make him any kind of a contender. McDaniel, a strong threat 2 years ago, has faded as time has gone by. Rock and Roll Express debuted at a level showing some regional interest, particularly among those who worked with them, but were not strong candidates. Moolah came just 6 votes shy last year, but this year faded greatly. Monsoon, who passed away this last year, did significantly better this year, but will likely never be a contender. Snyder is a victim of being too recent to be considered for consideration as a 40 star, but too distant as a borderline player to be considered. Han remains steady, and probably always will or fade. There were significant drops for Cologne, who fell from a strong 41% down to 17% this year, Snuka, Undertaker, and most notably Murdoch. Murdoch dropped from being one of the strongest candidates to not make it 2 years ago, garnering 50%, down to 41% last year and faded to 14% this year, largely as younger wrestlers and reporters who never saw him at his peak start entering the voting pool. Voters also didn't give a very strong response to Benoit, at only 14%, largely because, as I'd surmised, people still see him as a young wrestler even though he's in his 15th year, and someone climbing the ladder to be considered for the future. Of course, for what he has done in the ring, he should be in, but he has never been a major drawing card, or even a consistent main eventer in any company that has been a big success. Wrestling Observer. Hall of Fame balloting results. Votes needed to enter Hall of Fame: US and Canada 60, Japan 46, Mexico 33. Performer votes percentage. Shinya Hashimoto 59 votes 78%. Steve Austin 76 votes 77%. Mick Foley 71 votes 72%. Akira Hokuto 54 votes 71%. Grant Hamada 31 votes 56%. Shawn Michaels 53 votes 54%. Fabulous Freebirds 50 votes 51%. Hiroshi 36 votes 47%. Lismark 26 votes 47%. Bull Nakano 32 votes 42%. Jesse Ventura 32 votes 32%. Bob Backlund 28 votes 28%. Wahoo McDaniel 24 votes 24%. Rock and Roll Express 23 votes 23%. Fabulous Moolah 23 votes 23%. Gorilla Monsoon 22 votes 22%. Wilbur Snyder 22 votes 22%. Volthan 14 votes 18%. Seiji Sakaguchi 14 votes 18%. Carlos Colon 17 votes 17%. Owen Hart 17 votes 17%. Jimmy Snuka 16 votes 16%. Undertaker 16 votes 16%. El Satanico 8 votes 15%. Arn Anderson 14 votes 14%. Chris Benoit 14 votes 14%. Dick Murdoch 14 votes 14%. Pedro Morales 13 votes 13%. Eric Bischoff 13 votes 13%. Cien Cara 7 votes 13%. Gene and Ole Anderson 10 votes 10%. Less than 10% of the votes from the region and dropped from next year's balloting. Lou Albano, Masahiro Chono, Masakatsu Funaki, Chavo Guerrero, Conan, Boss Rutan, Sabu, Ken Shamrock. Steve Austin. The most valuable commodity in the hottest national wrestling war in history. Austin, at his short-lived peak, was the biggest star in the world, one of the biggest drawing cards in the history of the business and the biggest merchandise seller, by far, in history. Born December 18, 1964 and growing up as Steve Williams, that wasn't his name at birth, but he was adopted by the Williams family, in Victoria, Texas. He saw Houston wrestling on television since childhood. A top high school athlete, he went to North Texas State University on a football scholarship before hearing about Chris Adams' wrestling school in the Dallas area. He went to the school in 1989 and was immediately, because of his look and athletic ability, the star pupil. In an angle that had been done to death in Dallas, but was years ahead of its time nationally. Adams, seeing the potential in Austin, booked himself in a feud, using two women, Adams' wife at the time and his ex-wife, as the hooks. Adams and wife Tony against Austin and Jeannie Clark, Adams' first wife, made a major difference in the box office in 1990 for what was basically a dying Dallas promotion. While history likes to record Austin as this journeyman performer who suddenly, while doing an interview at the 1996 King of the Ring pay-per-view show, started on the road to being the hottest star in the business, the reality is more along the lines of him being a known top talent held back by World Championship Wrestling in favor of the older wrestlers, repeating the pattern that put the company in the state it's in today. Austin was named Rookie of the Year by Observer readers in 1990, and after only a few months in the business was being touted as the next Ric Flair, or at worst, the next Ted DiBiase. In 1991, he signed with WCW and was given a strong push, right up to being below the main event level. He basically remained stagnant, taking the slow climb from TV champion to tag team champion, the memorable team with Brian Pillman that many believe could have been the tag team of the decade if WCW hadn't decided to break them up as soon as they started gathering steam, to U.S. champion. Austin's career as a single seemed on the upswing after the tag team broke up, as he was the heel U.S. champ, working a program with Ricky Steamboat, which turned out to be Steamboat's final program as he suffered a career-ending injury in one of their matches in 1994. This was the same period as the ascension of Hulk Hogan in WCW, and Austin, on the sidelines with a torn tricep suffered in Japan, and already having knee problems, was believed to be not charismatic or marketable enough by Eric Bischoff, and in a move that will no doubt go down as pro wrestling's equivalent of Babe Ruth being traded by Boston to the Yankees, Austin was fired. After a brief stay in ECW, Austin debuted in the WWF as the Ringmaster, managed by DiBiase, a tremendous in-ring performer whose career was over that he was often compared with in his first 2 years as the $1 Million Champion, a belt DiBiase wore in his WWF days as somewhat of a consolation prize by Vince McMahon, who had promised DiBiase the WWF title at a WrestleMania, and created a belt to pacify him when the decision was changed to go to Randy Savage. That pairing was a flop, and Austin's career in the WWF was going nowhere. In fact, the WWF at the time was going nowhere. Suddenly, Jeannie Clark, who by this time was Jeannie Williams in one of those angles become reality deals that happens with amazing frequency in wrestling, came up with the nickname Stone Cold Steve Austin after the WWF marketing department came up with names like Frosty Steve Austin as a moniker for the idea of an ice-blooded killer that Austin came up with watching a movie on serial killers. When the WWF decided to punish Hunter Hearst Helmsley for doing the famed non-sanctioned curtain call at Madison Square Garden on Scott Hall and Kevin Nash's final night with the company, who was scheduled to win that year's King of the Ring, Austin managed to backdoor into immortality staring on June 23, 1996. After beating Jake Roberts, he did the Austin 3:16 speech and a merchandising empire was born. His career got its biggest boost over the next few months being pushed as a kick-ass heel, leading to a memorable match on November 17, 1996 with Bret Hart at the Survivor Series in Madison Square Garden, where Austin received a modicum of cheers against easily the most popular wrestler in the company at the time. Austin began receiving more cheers in house show matches against the company's other top star, Shawn Michaels, and on March 23, 1997, in one of the classic matches in the history of the WWF, Hart beat Austin in the I Quit match, where Austin never quit, and Austin was turned face and Hart heel. Austin didn't take off immediately, as he actually received, right after the turn, less cheers than Michaels at an ensuing pay-per-view singles match, but working most of 1997 against Bret and Owen Hart, started selling merchandise and becoming one of the business' hottest commodities. Just before his career was supposed to take off, winning the IC title from Owen Hart, during the match on August 3, 1997 at SummerSlam in East Rutherford, New Jersey, Hart had him too low while delivering a tombstone piledriver, and Austin was momentarily paralyzed. Specialist after specialist told him to retire. He stayed on TV every week as WWF was in a ratings war and on the losing end, and by this time, Austin was the company's biggest hope. Before long, Austin was booked all over the TV show in as many segments as possible, hoping to keep the losing gap close against the depth and star power of WCW. Austin couldn't even wrestle, but was advertised every week in a TV main event, with one bad excuse after another given as to why he couldn't do the match at the end. Finally, coinciding with his eventual return and the famed Survivor Series in Montreal, the WWF was on the ascension. No doubt the biggest angle in the start of the turnaround, besides McMahon coming out of Montreal as a strong heel, was Austin's program with Mike Tyson leading to WrestleMania on March 29, 1998. Where Austin beat Michaels with Tyson as referee, drawing the largest pay-per-view audience, 730,000 buys, up to that point in history, a record he broke at 800,000 the next year without celebrity help for a title win over The Rock. From there, both the WWF and Austin were off to the races. Due to his feud with McMahon, Raw became a Monday night institution. By April, it beat Nitro, ending the 83-week winning streak. Soon, with Austin as the featured performer, it left Nitro in the dust. Austin built the pay-per-view and house show business up to its current level with programs with Mick Foley, Kane, and most notably Undertaker, while battling persistent knee and neck problems. Austin bounced around the main title while battling the injuries over the next 14 months while having mainly great matches, although some fell short of their goal when his injuries were too much. Finally, the injuries were becoming more frequent, and the neck became aggravated to the point his career was in jeopardy. The WWF kept the serious injury quiet in order to squeeze one last huge buy rate out of their biggest star at Survivor Series 1999, where they did an angle where Austin was supposedly run over during the course of the show and thus couldn't wrestle in his scheduled main event match where he challenged for the title held at that point by Helmsley. Over Thanksgiving, after an examination of his neck revealing spinal stenosis, it appeared a good chance his career was over. He underwent surgery in January, returned for a cameo where he could do little but swing a chair, on an April pay-per-view show which drew more money than any non-major show in history, and is awaiting clearance, set for October, to resume his career most likely on a somewhat limited basis. Austin's Observer Awards include Wrestler of the Year in 1998, Biggest Drawing Card in 1998 and 1999, Feud of the Year in 1997, With the Hearts, 1998, with McMahon in 1999, also with McMahon, Tag Team of the Year in 1993, with Pillman Best on Interviews, 1996, 1997, 1998, Most Charismatic, 1997 and 1998, and his March 23, 1997 match with Bret Hart at WrestleMania was voted Match of the Year. Most important of all, was in headlining 26 pay-per-view shows over the past 4 years. Austin has had 12 shows deliver more than a 1.0 buy rate, third on the all-time list behind only Hulk Hogan and Ric Flair, who were on top for far longer. Those shows combined to draw more than 10 million pay-per-view buys, grossing the company more than $125 million. Mick Foley. Unlike Austin, Foley was a wrestler that very few in his early days saw this kind of potential in him. Foley was regarded as largely a crazy bump taker early on, before doing some strong promos and building good angles and great matches in WCW against the likes of Sting and Vader. He became something of a brawling legend, largely for his almost incomprehensible willingness to sacrifice his body for the art form and doing a compelling match and spawned a generation of imitators, which it is debatable if that is good or not. Although his style cost him early retirement, in his last few years, he made huge money and became one of the most popular wrestlers in the history of the industry, not to mention a best-selling author. Born June 7, 1965 and growing up as a huge wrestling fan in Setauket, New York, his history has become legendary. From his hitchhiking to Madison Square Garden to see the Jimmy Snuka vs. Don Morocco cage match on October 17, 1983 to his brutal Hell in a Cell match with Undertaker in Pittsburgh where he took 2 of the sickest bumps in wrestling history to his traveling every weekend from Cortland State University in upstate New York to Pittsburgh to be trained by Dominic DeNucci to his losing his ear in Germany to Vader, his story became one so surreal that nobody in fiction could have ever invented one so strange. Known first as Cactus Jack, and later Mankind and Dude Love, but more famous nowadays under his real name, he pioneered bumps such as the Nestia plunge and doing a hip-shattering elbow drop off the apron. The irony is that he gained his greatest fame as the reality of what he had done to his body was starting to take its toll. But still, through mastery of psychology and interviews, was, with a few bumps in the road toward the end, able to maintain his main event position with the WWF during the hottest period in the history of the company. Foley's road to the WWF was long and winding, starting by working in small circuits in Tennessee and Texas before having a strong run in WCW which saw him garner some major headline matches against Sting and Vader, largely because of how well it put the major stars over. He started gaining a cult following, and after one of the all-time worst, pre-1998 standards, angles where he supposedly had amnesia, an angle so embarrassing that he himself blew it off when he returned, and the promotion failing to capitalize on his ear coming off. Several decades earlier, a similar incident in a match with Killer Kowalski vs. Yukon Eric made both wrestling legends, but WCW never even built an angle with Vader based on the accident even though the two had previous history including 2 Savage matches at Center Stage in Atlanta to set up the amnesia, nor did WWF years later when both were in the company. After a stint in ECW where he did some of the best interviews in the history of wrestling, he went to WWF for the first time, with the idea of going in as Mankind the Mutilator. During the period between WCW and WWF, he was a regular for the IWA in Japan where he became a cult hero, particularly after Terry Funk put him over in the finals of the King of the Death Matches tournament on August 20, 1995 at Kawasaki Stadium before 28,757 fans. Mutilator never quite got there, and Mankind, a simple-minded tortured heel, put over Undertaker in the same manner he'd done so before with Sting and Vader, and resulted in what probably was the best match of his career, challenging Shawn Michaels for the WWF title. A series of TV interviews with Jim Ross, who ironically was responsible for getting Foley his first job with WCW, and later brought him into WWF, where he'd been turned down for a job numerous times by Vince McMahon, who felt he didn't have the look to be a star, resulted in Mankind becoming a lovable babyface. Dude Love, the babyface version based on DJ legend Wolfman Jack and a character in Foley's home movies from college, became exposed in those videos. It was his 1998 year that put him over the top, with pay-per-view main event matches against Rocky Maivia, Undertaker, and most notably Austin, working both face and heel roles and ending the year winning the WWF title from Rock on December 29, 1998 in Worcester, Massachusetts. While 1999 wasn't nearly the year in the ring, due to injuries and in particular a double knee surgery in the summer, relying more on comedy with a sock puppet Mr. Sacco, which he privately was torn about because the fan reaction to the puppet was so good and it was far easier on his body and his income rose as the WWF exploded in popularity, but the artist side of him was faced with a contradiction. Outside the ring, 1999 was even better, authoring a best-selling book and becoming the focal point of the movie Beyond the Mat, which received Academy Award consideration for Best Documentary. Foley's career as an active wrestler nearly ended on a romantic note, as he dropped all comedy for one last big run with pay-per-view main events that did gigantic business, did one of his career best interviews, followed by a classic match losing a Hell in the Cell bout to Hunter Hearst Helmsley, which at that point was the most purchased non-major pay-per-view in WWF history, 1 month after perhaps an even better main event at the Royal Rumble in Madison Square Garden with Helmsley. Foley was talked into returning for one last match at WrestleMania this year, sharing the spotlight with Big Show, Rock and Helmsley on the biggest grossing pro wrestling show ever and a pay-per-view record 825,000 buys, but it was not one of his better performances as he'd put on much weight after mentally telling himself his active career was over more than a month earlier. Promised 6 months off after Mania, it wound up being 3, and he remains one of the focal points of the company as a comedy figure as the figurehead commissioner. Whatever this means with the devaluation of titles, Foley ended his career with more total title reigns than any wrestler in WWF history. He was also named Best on Interviews in the 1995 Observer poll and Best Brawler every year from 1991 through 1999, actually winning it 9 times, surpassing even the man the award was named after, Bruiser Brody, who won it 7 times before his death. Shinya Hashimoto, the headliner on 8 shows that have drawn in excess of 50,000 fans, a record nobody in the recorded history of pro wrestling can match. Hashimoto was one of the 90s greatest in-ring world champions. Born on July 3, 1965 in the city of Toki in the Gifu Prefecture of Japan, Hashimoto lost both his parents at a young age and grew up raised by his grandmother coming from a very poor background. He started in judo in junior high school and started at the New Japan Dojo on April 21, 1984, the same day as the 2 men his career path would often cross with, Keiji Muto and Masahiro Chono, who were the headliners with him that led New Japan to its big glory period more than 1 decade later. Barely 4 months later made his pro debut in Tokyo on September 1, 1984. After wrestling a few years in the undercards, he was sent to the United States for seasoning and a break so he could be brought back with a push. Wrestling under the name Hashif Khan, he worked first in Calgary, and later in Puerto Rico and Tennessee before being brought back on April 24, 1989 on the first ever pro wrestling show at the Tokyo Dome. He was pushed for stardom from the return, scoring a shocking pin over Riki Choshu in just 3:41 in the first round of a tournament for the vacant IWGP heavyweight title. He then defeated Russian Viktor Zangyev in the second round, before losing to Big Van Vader in the finals. Although not the top drawing match, he was actually in the main event spot for the first time at the second Tokyo Dome show on February 10, 1990, New Japan's first sellout in the building, teaming with Chono to lose to Antonio Inoki and Seiji Sakaguchi in a match with Luthez as referee. He captured his first of 3 IWGP heavyweight titles on September 20, 1993 in Nagoya from Muto. His first major title win came when he and Masa Saito beat Choshu and Takayuki Iizuka on September 20, 1989 in Osaka to win the IWGP Tag titles, largely to set up the Muto and Chono team for a big run the next year after losing it. Hashimoto was always pushed as a tough guy, or shooter, often on big shows facing non-pro wrestlers and martial arts bouts, similar to the gimmick that put Antonio Inoki on the map past just the wrestling audience in the late 70s. In 1990, Hashimoto created his first foreign star by putting over Tony Halme, doing a boxer gimmick, in a series of what was billed as boxer versus wrestler matches, in a feud that lasted nearly a full year. Muto, Chono, and Hashimoto, as the Three Musketeers, were what the New Japan office was built around in the early 90s, before Hashimoto broke up the group in 1993 for matches with Genichiro Tenryu and the first heel win over Muto. It wasn't until February 17, 1994 that he scored his first pinfall on Tenryu. His second IWGP heavyweight title reign was for a full year, from May 1, 1994 beating Tatsumi Fujinami, until May 3, 1995 losing to Muto at the Fukuoka Dome. His third reign, from April 29, 1996 when he beat Nobuhiko Takada in their famous Tokyo Dome match which drew 65,000 fans, until losing it on August 31, 1997 in Yokohama to Kensuke Sasaki, was the longest title reign in history, some 19 months, including 2 dome matches against Naoya Ogawa. Ogawa, a former Olympic silver medalist in judo, in his pro debut, beat Hashimoto, the World Heavyweight Wrestling Champion, at the Tokyo Dome on April 12, 1997, to set up a sellout on May 3, 1997 on the first pro wrestling show ever at the Osaka Dome where Hashimoto retained his title in the rematch. Known in the ring for being perhaps the best man in the game at hot tags and fiery comebacks, the 19 months have seen his career take a beating in the feud with Naoya Ogawa, and Hashimoto, in their January 4, 1999 match made Ogawa into a legit superstar, with what was very close to a shooting match at the Tokyo Dome, created a new concept of working style which is the only pro wrestling angle to draw huge interest in Japan during that time period. The Hashimoto vs. Ogawa feud was the only hot item during a dead period in Japanese pro wrestling over the past 2 years, with 4 dome headliners, none of which Hashimoto was able to beat Ogawa in, including a match where Hashimoto vowed to retire if he lost on April 7, 2000 at the Tokyo Dome, which drew the largest audience to witness a live pro wrestling match, approximately 34 million viewers, for any match in the world in at least 10 years, although the live crowd was only 45,000. Other career highlights include winning the 1998 G1 Climax Tournament and headlining January 4, 1995 and January 4, 1997 Dome shows with wins over Kensuke Sasaki and Choshu, respectively. Akira Hokuto, nicknamed Dangerous Queen, her short career on top still was enough to probably rank her as one of the top women wrestlers who ever lived. Born Hisako Uno on July 13, 1967 in Yoshikawa, a small town in Saitama. She played softball in high school but showed up at the New Japan Dojo with a friend during the height of the Crush Gals phenomenon in 1985, and after meeting Kunyaki Kobayashi, she dropped out of high school and joined the All Japan Women's Dojo and debuted a month before her 18th birthday. Within a few months, she was getting a push, winning the women's junior title from Condor Saito on March 20, 1986 in her first title challenge. She graduated all the way to the WWA Tag titles on April 15, 1987 with a win over Leilani Kai and Judy Martin, but quickly lost them to Yumi Ogura and Kazue Nagahori 12 days later in a match where Ogawa gave her a tombstone piledriver off the middle ropes in the second fall and legitimately broke her neck. Similar to the stories of Danny Hodge swimming and walking himself, holding his head on while going for help after the auto accident that for all real purposes ended his career, Uno came back to wrestle the third fall, literally holding her head on her neck, with her hands while attempting to finish the match, and doing all the planned third fall spots, which she did. The footage of that third fall is some of the most remarkable in pro wrestling history. It was the first time the move was ever done in Japan, and may have been the last time as well. She was immediately told her career was over, and when she got the news that she would never wrestle again, she actually threatened suicide climbing out the hospital window and standing on the ledge. She came back only 7 months later, changed her name to Akira Hokuto, formed a tag team with Suzuka Minami called the Marine Wolves, and quickly was regarded as the best worker in the company during a comeback period for the All Japan Women's promotion. Before her name change, Uno and Mika Suzuki, later Suzuka Minami, won the 1988 Tag Team Tournament, which she repeated in 1993 with Minami Toyota as her partner. After the retirement of Lioness Asuka broke up the Crush Gals, who held the WWA Tag titles, Hokuto and Minami won the tournament to crown new champs and had a three-way feud with the Jungle Jacks, Asia Kong and Bison Kimura, and the Fire Jets, Yumiko Hata and Mitsuko Nishiwaki for the last 6 months of 1989 and all of 1990. She had classic matches with the likes of Manami Toyota, Bull Nakano, Asia Kong, Kyoko Inoue and Tashiya Yamada during the comeback period of the promotion, at which point the wrestling quality of the top matches blew away nearly anything in wrestling. Without question, the defining moments of her career were two matches with Shinobu Kondori in 1993, the latter of which was a retirement match she lost, drawing both the first women's sellout of the Yokohama Arena and later the first sellout at Tokyo Sumo Hall. She also won the Japan Grand Prix tournament that summer. The retirement was largely because she had married a Mexican wrestler and was moving to Mexico to live with him in 1994, as well as the accumulation of so many ring injuries, but the marriage didn't last. She returned to Japan on March 27, 1994, selling out the Yokohama Arena for Wrestling Queendom 2 by teaming with Kondori, beating Kong and Nakano in the main event in 35-13. On July 30, 1994 in Puebla, she won the CMLL women's title under a mask as Reina Jubuki from La Diabolica and held it for more than 2 years before vacating it after leaving Mexico for good. The title win led to her return to Japan as the biggest star on the biggest women's wrestling show ever, on November 20, 1994 at the Tokyo Dome before 42,500 fans, paying $4 million, where she won the 5-star tournament beating Eagle Sowai, Dynamite Kansai and Kong. On April 28, 1995, Pyongyang, North Korea, Hokuto and Nakano beat Toyota and Mariko Yoshida in a prelim match before 150,000 fans at a sports festival put on by the North Korean government, which included an appearance by Muhammad Ali. That night, Hokuto hooked up with Kensuke Sasaki, and before the night was over, their first date ended up in an engagement. It should be noted Hokuto pinned Nakano the next night in the same building before a pro wrestling record 170,000 fans underneath the Antonio Inoki vs. Ric Flair match. By this point, Hokuto would need numerous pain-killing injections just to perform. She married Sasaki, quit All Japan Women to join the Gia promotion, and gave birth to a son in November of 1997, not returning to the ring until the summer of 1999. Although she won minor women's world titles in both Mexico and the WCW version briefly in the United States, Hokuto's career was marked by never holding the WWA title despite numerous challenges. Bill Longson. While Bill Longson may have been the greatest drawing card in the storied history of St. Louis wrestling, Longson is reputed to be the man who both invented and popularized the piledriver in the 1940s, as well as being the first true heel and brawler type, said to be like an early version of a Bruiser Brody, to be a long-term world champion. During his peak of his drawing power, Longson headlined 39 shows in 1 year, 1944, in St. Louis alone, which drew more than 390,000 fans, and his record for 16 consecutive major arena sellouts in St. Louis for promoter Tom Pax remains to this day the hottest period for wrestling in that city, and most impressively, done before the days of television. Longson was born in 1908 in Salt Lake City. He was a state amateur champion in both boxing and wrestling in 1931 and once fought and was knocked out by the legendary Jack Dempsey. Longson was not a major star early in his career, as he started pro wrestling in 1931 and wasn't really a major success until 1938 on the West Coast as the Purple Shadow, losing his mask to Bronco Nagurski on August 23 of that year. Longson held the National Wrestling Association World Heavyweight title 3 times, including one of the longer title reigns in history. He first defeated Shandor Sabo on February 19, 1942 in St. Louis and unified the NWA and AWA titles with a win over Yvonne Robert, AWA champion, in Montreal on August 19, 1942, before dropping the unified title to Yvonne Robert on October 7 of that year in Montreal. The titles were split apart at the end of 1942 when Robert dropped the NWA title but remained as AWA champion. Exactly 1 year to the day of his first reign, on February 19, 1943, he won the NWA title back in St. Louis from Bobby Manigoff, and held it until dropping it to Whipper Billy Watson in St. Louis on February 21, 1947. His final reign came also in St. Louis, with a win over Lou Thez on November 21, 1947 before he dropped it back to Thez on July 20, 1948 in Indianapolis. The finish of that match was legendary, as Longson took a bump out of the ring and caught his ankle in a small bucket, suffering an injury and being unable to continue. It is said the margin of error to pull that bump off was amazing. Longson came to prominence as the Purple Shadow, going to the finals of the Pacific Coast title tournament before losing to Sabo. After unmasking, Longson captured that title on 3 occasions as his stepping stone to world title contendership, with wins over Sabo, Manigoff, and Frank Sexton. Longson was a top draw in the St. Louis, Memphis, and Houston circuit, but was never a major star in the Northeast. In those days when travel was by driving, it wasn't unusual for Longson to drive from Houston to St. Louis to Toronto for a weekend of big show bookings. When PAC started having money problems due to gambling debts, Thez and Longson bought the promotion from him, although the public was never aware the two hated rivals were actually business partners. The Missouri Valley Wrestling Club and Sam Mushnick's St. Louis Wrestling Club were at odds until Thez and Mushnick brokered a merger, leaving Longson as 15% owner of the business Mushnick controlled. Longson remained a frequent headliner in St. Louis in the 50s, challenging Thez for the NWA title, but never held a major title during that decade, and also had a big feud with Kowalski and Pat O'Connor before being more of a backstage presence who continued to wrestle sporadically as the 50s wound down. Longson worked in the front office and as a part owner of the St. Louis Wrestling Club until finally selling his stock in the late 70s to Vern Gagne. His final main event was with Gene Kiniski on January 22, 1960 at Kiel Auditorium, and he retired later that year. In the 60s and 70s, he was a fixture at the St. Louis shows and was actually in charge of the box office and payoffs, which nobody knew, as he'd at every show walk through the crowd with $20,000 to $30,000 in cash while the older fans would recognize him. He passed away in December 1982 after a stroke to a surprisingly limited amount of fanfare. Frank Sexton. One of the biggest names of the 1940s, Sexton had a nearly 5-year reign as AWA World Heavyweight Champion, which may have been the premier title in the world at the time, winning from Steve Casey on June 27, 1945 in Boston before losing to Don Eagle on May 23, 1950 in Cleveland. Born in 1914, Sexton was a three-sport star at Ohio State, playing football, baseball and wrestling as a freshman, and started doing pro wrestling in 1932 with his ring gimmick, wearing his basketball trunks and his Ohio State school sweater. His career took off in 1941, wrestling on the West Coast under a mask as the Black Panther, winning the Pacific Coast title from Bobby Manigoff. After being unmasked later that year, he stayed out west until 1944, at which point he became known as a national star, stemming from a September 9, 1941 60 Minutes draw with National Wrestling Association champion Shandor Sabo. He held the Pacific Coast title a third time for 2 years. When he returned to the Northeast, he put together a string of wins over Hall of Famers Earl McCready, Strangler Lewis, and Whipper Billy Watson, leading to 2 60 Minutes draws against National Wrestling Association world champion Bill Longson. Sexton held the Canadian world title, feuding with Yvonne Robert, and then beat Shandor Sabo to win the AWA title for the first time. During his long second reign, Sexton, whose title belt was considered by many as the top in the world, including wearing the same belt that Strangler Lewis wore in the 20s, not only went all over the world with the belt, including matches against Henri de Glane in France and Bert Asarati in England, a 1-hour draw that drew more than 15,000 fans, but after losing to Eagle, returned working in France and South Africa, still billed as world heavyweight champion, and given the gimmick in South Africa as the man who can't be pinned. During that long reign, he had more title versus title matches against various major champions than any wrestler in history. In 1945, he retained his title over British Empire champion Watson. In 1946, he went to a 58 minutes draw and a title versus title match with NWA champ Longson in Toronto. 2 weeks later, he beat Babe Sharkey in a title unification match, Sharkey having been recognized as world champion in several states on the East Coast. On March 27, 1947, in Long Beach, California, Sexton pinned Sabo, at the time the NWA champion, but only Sexton's AWA belt was at stake. A week later, he went to a draw against Enrique Torres, recognized as a world champion on the West Coast, and setting up another draw later in the year. In 1948, Sexton and Lou Thez, then NWA champion, had a unification match in Los Angeles which went to a draw. Sexton won a 60 minutes match via decision over Cliff Gustafson, recognized in Minnesota as the world champion, and then had a rematch 3 weeks later. After the more famous National Wrestling Alliance was formed, Sexton met first champ Orville Brown in Cleveland on March 15, 1949, and went 105 minutes to a draw. Sexton, with the possible exception of Thez, was considered the top star of the 40s due to his image of being a classic-style wrestler, and his good looks, and the fact he avoided being drafted into World War II. He was a major box office draw in not only New England, but also California, Cleveland, Buffalo, St. Louis, Montreal, Toronto, as well as in Paris. Sexton is believed to have passed away in the early 90s. Shandor Sabo. Billed as the 1928 Olympic champion, although that was not the case. He was also billed as being a member of the 1928 Hungarian Olympic team in both Greco-Roman wrestling and in water polo in 1928 at times, although there is no record of a Sandor Szabo on either team. Either way, Szabo was considered a great legitimate wrestler as he trained under famous Hungarian wrestler Bela Varga. Spending most of his career in Southern California, he played water polo in Santa Monica on the same team as movie stars Buster Crabbe and Johnny Weissmuller and appeared in several movies himself. Born January 4, 1906, Szabo lived hard and fast, passing away on October 13, 1966 of a heart attack in Santa Monica. His legitimate wrestling skill was respected enough that when began his pro career on October 13, 1930 in New York, he was pushed from the start, a rarity in the business due to his physique. Billed as the Hungarian Adonis, doing a winning streak gimmick that lasted 5 months and was from the start a fixture in Madison Square Garden, with his first main event coming in March of 1931 on a benefit show for the Hungarian Church Building Fund, losing to Jim McMillan before 10,000 fans, which was reportedly only his second pro loss. Szabo, as noted by his nickname, was unusually muscular for an athlete of that era with, in the pre-steroid era, a physique that could be described as similar to a Ken Shamrock, which led to him getting many roles in movies. He was considered during that period, in particular, a big draw with women fans. From that point he frequently working second from the top underneath Jimmy Londos, winning semifinals leading to a title match where Londos won, in only Szabo's third pro loss, before 12,000 fans. Szabo also worked high on the cards during the two biggest New York shows of that era, the 1931 show at Yankee Stadium, which drew 21,000 fans, headlined by Londos vs. Ray Steele, drew with McMillan, and the 1932 show at the Madison Square Garden Bowl, which drew 25,000, headlined by Strangler Lewis vs. Dick Schickat, beating Norton Jackson. In 1934, he came to the West Coast and remained a headliner there for 3 decades. On October 5, 1937, he defeated Boo Pinder in San Francisco at the old Dreamland Auditorium and mud wrestling match, the second mud wrestling match ever in the United States, the success of which started a fad during that time period. He may have been the first heavyweight to regularly deliver suplexes in the U.S., using the Greco-Roman backdrop later popularized in Japan by Lou Thesz, as his finisher. He rarely left the West Coast except for runs leading to him becoming world champion elsewhere. Ironically, the California version of the world title was the only one that eluded him, although he briefly claimed it when Champ Londos left the territory, showing a match on November 27, 1940 at the Olympic. But when peace was made with Londos, he returned, billed as the real champion, and won the Battle of the Heartthrobs on Valentine's Day in 1941. He may have been the only wrestler to wear the AWA title, the same belt worn by Strangler Lewis in the 20s, the NWA belt, the same belt popularized by Lou Thesz, and Montreal belt, popularized by Don Eagle, and the Minnesota belt, popularized by Joe Stecker. During his career, Szabo held the National Wrestling Association title, beating Bronco Nagurski on June 5, 1941 and losing to Bill Longson on February 19, 1942, the Montreal belt in 1944, feuding with Robert, the AWA belt for 1 week, setting up Frank Sexton's 5-year run, and the Minnesota version of the NWA title 4 times between 1946-48, feuding with the likes of Cliff Gustafson and Nagurski. It also held the Pacific Coast title 13 times between 1937 and 1951, making him the biggest long-term headliner in San Francisco in history, even ahead of Ray Stevens, before he stopped working in San Francisco in 1952 and worked almost exclusively in the Los Angeles metropolitan area and traveling generally only to Salt Lake City, working on top during a down period, garnering the old international TV and tag titles on several occasions through 1960. He was also World Tag Team Champion on the West Coast with partners like Primo Carnera, Killer Kowalski and Ronnie Etchison during the heyday of the Sharp Brothers in the early 50s. On August 17, 1938, he sold out the 10,400-seat Olympic Auditorium, challenging Nagurski for the world title in a match that went 155 minutes to a draw. On August 8, 1939 in Los Angeles at the Olympic, he went 130 minutes to a draw with Londos in a world title match. He was a frequent headliner in St. Louis, drawing consistent good to great crowds with Longson as well as strong California programs with Nagurski and Londos. Szabo remained a fixture high on the cards as well as working with Jules Strongbow handling the booking for the Southern California territory. As late as 1961, at the age of 55, he was still a singles headliner against the likes of WWA champion Fred Blassie as well as Mr. Moto, but was slowing down his schedule and often working as a referee in the smaller markets. He had a big summer program at the Olympic Auditorium challenging for Blassie's belt, peaking with a sellout on August 16, 1961 at the Olympic where he lost to Blassie. His last match in California was December 30th of that year, likely due to a California Commission rule that was enforced, the same rule that led to Fred Blassie leaving Southern California for the WWF in 1974, that a wrestler couldn't be licensed after the age of 55. In 1962, he largely did a headline program in Las Vegas with the Destroyer, wrestling only sparingly that year before retiring after the 1963 World League Tournament in Japan, where he faced the likes of Antonio Inoki, Toyono Bori, Michiaki Yoshimura, Haystacks Calhoun, Giant Baba, Kintaro Oki, Gorilla Monsoon, Killer Kowalski and Pat O'Connor, with his final match on April 17th of that year in Japan. At the time of his death, he was lauded in wrestling publications as one of the 25 greatest pro wrestlers of all time. Thanks to Steve Yohei and John Williams for background on Longson and Sexton, as well Jim Melby's book, 1018 East Rose Avenue, St. Paul, Minnesota 55106, on the ring record of Sabo. We began the Observer Hall of Fame in 1996 with the following people: Hiro Aguayo, Andre the Giant, Bert Asarati, Giant Baba, Jim Barnett, Wild Red Berry, Fred Blassie, Nick Bockwinkel, Paul Bosch, Bobo Brazil, Jack Briscoe, Bruiser Brody, Dick the Bruiser, Mildred Burke, Abdullah the Butcher, Kanek, Negro Casas, Ricky Choshu, Jim Cornette, The Crusher, Alfonso Dantes, Blue Demon, The Destroyer, Ted DiBiase, Dusek Family Riot Squad, Jackie Fargo, Ric Flair, Tatsumi Fujinami, Dory Funk Jr., Dory Funk Sr., Terry Funk, Vern Gagne Cavernario Galindo, Ed Don George, Gorgeous George, Frank Gotch, Carl Gotch, Billy Graham, Eddie Graham, Rene Guajardo, Rory Guerrero, George Hockenschmidt, Stan Hansen, Bret Hart, Stu Hart, Bobby Heenan, Danny Hodge, Hulk Hogan, Antonio Inoki, Rayo de Jalisco Sr., Tom Jenkins, Don Leo Jonathan, Fabulous Kangaroos, Al Costello and Roy Heffernan, Dynamite Kid, Gene Kiniski, Fred Kohler, Killer Kowalski, Ernie Ladd, Dick Lane, Jerry Lawler, Strangler Lewis, Jim Londos, Salvador Lutteroth, Akira Maeda, Devil Masami, Mil Mascaras, Tiger Mask, Satoru Sayama, Dump Matsumoto, Earl McCready, Leroy McGurk, Vince McMahon Jr., Vince McMahon Sr., Nanny McShane, Ray Mendoza, Meet Suharu Misawa, Joe Tootsmont, Sam Mushnick, Bronco Nagurski, Pat O'Connor, Kintaro Oki, Atsushi Onita, Pat Patterson, Antonio Pena, John Pesic, Roddy Piper, Harley Race, Dusty Rhodes, Rikitos, Yvonne Robert, Antonino Rocca, Road Warriors, Billy Robinson, Buddy Rogers, Lance Russell, Bruno Sammartino, Billy Sandow, El Santo, Jackie Sato, Randy Savage, The Sheik, Hisashi Shinma, Dara Singh, Gordon Soley, El Solitario, Ricky Steamboat, Joe Stecker, Tony Stecker, Ray Steele, Ray Stevens, Nobuhiko Takada, Benichiro Tenryu, Luthez Jumbo Tsuruta, Frank Tunney, Mad Dog Vachon, Big Van Vader, Johnny Valentine, Fritz Von Erich, Whipper Billy Watson, Cowboy Bill Watts, Jaguar Yokoda, Stanislaw Sabishko. Inducted in 1997 were Edward Carpentier, Toshiaki Kawada, Jimmy Lennon, William Muldoon, and Chigusa Nagio. In 1998, the first-year inductions were done by a voting panel. The only person getting 60% of the vote for inclusion was Dos Caras. In 1999, making the Hall were Linus Asuka, Jushin Liger, Keiji Muto, and Jim Ross. When other potential candidates become eligible: Ultimo Dragon 2002, Triple H 2004, Kenta Kobashi 2002, Rock 2007, Kazushi Sakuraba 2004, Great Sasuke 2004, Kiyoshi Tamura 2004, Manami Toyota 2002. The situation regarding the financial decline and murky future of World Championship Wrestling continued over the past week. Vince Russo, in a WCW Live interview which had numerous people internally spinning their heads, stated that he had just 60 weeks left on his contract, and at that point, if he lasted that long, which he doubted he would, that he would leave pro wrestling forever. Of course, the credibility of everything has to be questioned when he also stated that he would be offering Bill Goldberg his release on Nitro, and that was for real, when of course, it was another scripted angle. Since any turnaround is long-term, if Russo was truly adamant about leaving, there would be no point having him, because success or failure, there would need to be another change long before the company would be either competitive or solvent. Rumors of Russo's days being numbered got stronger, coming on the heels of the poor Canadian television shows and the continued lack of improvement in every facet of the business, as exemplified again this past weekend when WCW went on the road with Booker T as champion to poor houses. This has led for the first time to people stirring up Booker T's positioning, noting that he sometimes doesn't get pops befitting a champion for his run-ins, for example, although he's gotten very good heat for his matches for the most part, and that the fans are cheering Nash and booing him so far in their TV build-up for the next pay-per-view. Russo remains popular among the young wrestlers, as well as veterans who have moved up on the card because of the absence of so many of the older wrestlers that had dominated main events for years, but much of the rest of the company has lost confidence in his abilities and grown tired of his weekly excuses. He even once again made the suggestion that Nitro should have a wrestling-type show as a lead-in and go head-to-head with Raw from 9 to 11 p.m. on Monday, which he first proposed months back. Unless the move to TNN seriously destroys the ratings of Raw, a move at this point, particularly in the middle of football season, would result in ratings falling to a 2.0 to 2.1 level, and perhaps even slightly lower. He blamed the lack of turnaround on the fact that the company hasn't publicized hard enough that this is a new product. The reality is that there has been phenomenal publicity for all of Russo's false starts that led to a huge jump due to curiosity in the ratings, starting at a 3.4 last October and 3.06 for the beginning of the Bischoff and Russo era in April. In both cases, after the big hype, the ratings slid back to lower levels than the shows had done with the previous regimes, showing an inability to maintain interest among the new viewers all the hype brought in. He also stated WCW needs to have a celebrity type of angle similar to how WWF used Mike Tyson to garner interest in the product, which is a good idea if the company itself was putting out a hot product. Again, WWF's upward momentum was clear from the box office months before the Tyson angle, which no doubt helped with the mainstream and sped up the increase in business and took Steve Austin to a new level. But even without Tyson, the WWF would have gotten exactly where it is today, but it may have taken a few more months. The Tyson angle worked huge because it was an excellent angle from start to finish. WCW did celebrity angles using Dennis Rodman and Karl Malone, which did big business, and then with Jay Leno, which didn't. But they didn't change the overall downward trend in the product even with all the mainstream talk. And like Dennis Miller is proving every Monday, talk on the street doesn't necessarily result in more people watching. He claimed that if he hadn't had his throat cut in January, by this point WCW would be only 1 point behind WWF, and claimed that Kurt Angle is the only new guy the WWF has made into a star since he left the company nearly 1 year ago, and claimed that Midaja would be the next Sable. With literally no warning, the WCW Saturday show was canceled on August 17th, a day after the usual Wednesday taping for the show that aired on August 19th. The company didn't even bother to edit anything into the show to indicate that for the first time since the early 1970s, there would be no weekend programming on TBS. Worldwide, which will no longer have any first-run matches taped after another 6 or so weeks and become a compilation show, is also thought to be in grave danger. The current plan for the television tapings also has people wondering about the potential for production nightmares. The plan is to start the tapings at 7 p.m. Eastern Time and 6 p.m. Central, which would mean 4 p.m. starts on the West Coast. They would then tape Nitro for 2 hours, and it would be taped without commercial breaks, and pre-tapes would be inserted into the show in post-production, and the show would air on a 1-hour delay. This means that the production crew would still be taping the second half of the show at the time the first half would be in the process of airing and being put together. The figuring is they could get the Nitro tapings over by 8:45 p.m. and start Thunder by 9 p.m. and have the shows end by 10:30 p.m., so the live audience wouldn't be as burned out, as Thunder would just be taping the matches and live interviews, and again pre-tapes would have 2 days to be edited into the show. Considering all the production glitches WCW's programming has had, including segments put in the wrong order, without this kind of post-production pressure, this is a scary undertaking. The news breaking in the Atlanta Journal-Constitution during the week of the Terry Bollea lawsuit against Russo and WCW brought back more questioning of exactly what happened at the Great American Bash pay-per-view. Many feel the lawsuit's existence proves that what went down was a shoot, but that only makes everyone involved look bad because business has declined from that point, and the only valid defense for it from a business standpoint, if they are creating an artificial decline, knowing when the work pays off and everyone returns under Eric Bischoff, it would result in a big rebound. If it was a shoot, it brings even more questioning of the judgment of Russo, but even more so Brad Siegel, for backing Russo when he would have done a double cross on television and screwed fans out of, for better or worse, what was advertised as the main event, but more so, put the company in harm's way of a lawsuit by what was a childish interview had it been a shoot. If it was a work, on the other hand, it was tremendous in execution that night, except by this point, the credibility problem in working the boys breeds more future locker room problems that the company doesn't need. For whatever it's worth, the mood among the wrestlers is back toward believing it was real, and among the non-wrestlers in the office, continues to be far more skeptical. The lawsuit itself is legitimate, filed in Fulton County Superior Court, and Hogan's attorney, John Taylor, who has a lot of experience in pro wrestling dating back nearly 2 decades, having represented Jim Barnett, Ric Flair, and Vince McMahon among others in the past, with Taylor saying Russo's interview on that show wasn't part of the script, nor is the lawsuit a publicity stunt. A lawyer potentially could be disbarred for knowingly filing a fake lawsuit, although that actually happening is another story. Taylor claimed Russo's comments were defamatory as well as a breach of contract, since Ballia's contract with WCW doesn't allow the company to do anything that would damage the character of Hulk Hogan. Taylor also claimed that Hogan's children were in attendance during the interview, although the convenient television cameras seemed to show Hogan and his son leaving the building just before the interview. Reaction to the legitimacy of all this is mixed. It has been noted Flair was involved in legitimate legal interaction with Bischoff that numerous wrestlers from the start to the finish believed was all part of an orchestrated angle. When Flair returned, their beliefs were confirmed by everything that took place afterwards, with Flair working an angle with Bischoff over those same issues. Now I am of the belief that the Flair lawsuit by Bischoff was legitimate and they turned it into an angle after the fact, but in this day and age, I'm also of the belief that the people in WCW at this point would go so far as to work a lawsuit to the point of filing it if it meant getting an angle over, since they went to the lengths of sending Brian Pillman a legal termination notice to work the boys on an angle that ended up never making anyone a dime and allowed Pillman to work them right into free agency. But the Ballia lawsuit is ridiculous on the surface. First off, if what happened at the Bash was as Hogan and Russo claim, and I don't believe it for a second because the credibility of both has been damaged beyond repair and Russo is still out there crying wolf, shoot, every week for some angle, how could Ballia win a lawsuit because someone criticized him during a wrestling television show? That's wrestling and it's been going on with Hogan for 20 years. Where are the damages? Hogan is a public person. It's virtually impossible to slander a public person without recklessly disregarding facts and knowingly lying. If the situation really went down as they claim, Russo's interview was largely the truth, since he said he was playing politics all day long and Hogan invoked his creative control card. Both, if this story isn't a work, is true, and any criticism of Hogan as it pertains to the company fortunes is probably accurate and even if debatable, certainly within the realm of fair comment. Moreover, how is a jury supposed to believe someone who plays a heel on television running down someone who plays a babyface on television, doing an interview on television, is to the public, damaging their reputation? The silliness of the actual charges being claimed in the lawsuit as far as damaging to a pro wrestler and it being filed seems to say publicity stunt. Among the roster cuts over the past week or so, besides officially cutting every Mexican performer except Rey Mysterio Jr. and Juventud Guerrera, they had already stopped using them, and this was more officially stopping payments since the handwriting was on the wall. Alex Wright, Kurt Hennig, Len Carlson, Lenny Lane, who ironically was just coming off an aborted angle where he had a work contract dispute, Christopher Daniels, Jim Duggan, Brian Yandrasovitz, Knobs, Elizabeth Hewlett, Liz, and Mike Rotunda. Although he has not been fired at press time, Marcus Bagwell's situation is considered very tenuous and he wasn't used at television this week. Bagwell, who has 6 months left on his contract, is in the doghouse because he continually complains about his positioning and was particularly unhappy having to do a TV job to Big Vito. There have been numerous feelers from WCW wrestlers looking to get into WWF. At this point, while there have been talks, nothing at the level of serious negotiations have taken place because WCW has yet to release any of its top talent. Rumors have the company wanting to slash the talent budget anywhere from $12 million, as has been reported, to $20 million, as we're told is the accurate figure. But cutting dozens of low-end guys doesn't come close to hitting that figure. In fact, the firing of Daniels seems the most perplexing. With the company on a youth movement, as they need to be, and on a cost-cutting movement, which they also need to be, why cut a $75,000 per year wrestler who is a good worker when so many of the new wrestlers have higher contracts and have nowhere near the in-ring talent or acting ability? For economic reasons as well as television quality reasons even more so, that's exactly the type of performer who should be getting a push because so many of the guys getting pushes are clearly not ready, and some may never be ready. The Daniels decision was simply an inability to justify keeping someone on salary who has only worked something like 3 dates since he's joined the company, but it probably more than any other talent decision shows a lack of an eye for talent by those making the calls. But perhaps WCW also has to politically at this point justify the power plant by pushing green guys who went through the system and attempting to make stars out of them. The company was ordered to cut people whose 90-day cycles were coming up that they couldn't live without. Mike Hayner, Prince Iokea, has been dropped from TV after he was trying to negotiate a better deal after his contract expires, believed to be in November. It is believed he will be let go at that point. The women playing the second Papaya, a Pittsburgh area stripper, with Hayner being dropped, was then let go after just 2 weeks, because she hadn't signed a contract, while Paisley was under a talent contract and with Hayner gone, was moved into the Papaya spot as the second for Alan Funk, Hui Wee. The second Papaya was already, in her second week, complaining about the travel schedule involved in wrestling, and may not have lasted anyway. Much of the speculation regarding major names and their futures revolves around Paige Falkenberg, DDP, Larry Fole, Lex Luger, Kimberly Falkenberg, Bagwell and Chris Cluseritis, Canyon, and to a lesser extent Anibal Gonzalez, Juventud Guerrera. It is believed feelers have been sent regarding most if not all of them, as well as others, regarding the WWF. The belief is WWF has no interest in Fole. The situation in most, and perhaps the cases of just about all the rest, with perhaps one exception, is that any offer from the WWF if they were to get a release, would come with a downside guarantee which on paper would appear to be a major pay cut. If the wrestlers were to become stars in the WWF, their income could surpass what their WCW guarantee is, as both Chris Benoit and Chris Jericho, who made the move while getting a lower guarantee. Actually, Jericho's guarantee in WWF was more than his WCW guarantee, but it was less than WCW offered him for a new deal, earning more than they would have had they stayed in WCW. But there is no guarantees in a very competitive WWF environment of what position they'd shake out and end up with. But the WWF seems to be feeling it's in the position, and it is, that they don't need anyone, and don't need to upset their pay scale to get anyone, but their downside guarantee pay scale for someone like DDP would be far less than his current WCW contract. At press time, there has still been no indication that any serious contract buyout negotiations for the major talent has taken place. Most of the big money talent have contracts that don't allow them to be fired. Fole, as an example, doesn't appear happy, but does appear willing to take the money, not be used on television, and go on the road and job to everyone. The belief is that Russo doesn't want Paige around, but Paige has always been close with Bischoff, and there is certainly a strong feeling that Bischoff will be back in power soon. Canyon has asked unsuccessfully in the past for a release, and the talk at television was that they still wanted him. He's still on television doing the DDP imitation gimmick, which makes little sense at this point unless DDP returns, which originally was the plan as of a few weeks ago. Those who have from the start speculated an elaborate work point to Paige, Luger, Hogan, Bischoff and Flair all being off television, only one of whom is injured, the Tanking of Thunder, which was originally talked about as the show they would take over, as evidence that the big plan is falling perfectly into place. Tony Cannonball Parisi, a mid-card fixture mainly in Ontario and upstate New York who toured the world during the 60s and 70s, passed away on August 19 from a heart attack at the age of 58. Parisi, who also wrestled as Antonio Parisi and Antonio Tony Pugliese, the latter in the WWF under the guise of being the first cousin of Bruno Sammartino, virtually was always in the role of a mid-card Italian ethnic babyface with his thick accent and look. Parisi's biggest success came in his first WWF run in the late 1960s, followed by his biggest money run working for Jim Barnett in Australia, where Italians were often big draws, as a multi-time tag team champion. During the 1970s, Parisi spent a year working for Roy Shire out of San Francisco and had a second run in the WWF, which included headlining Madison Square Garden before returning home to Niagara Falls, ONT, where he used his wrestling savings to buy a hotel and restaurant. He wrestled throughout the late 70s and into the mid-80s, largely as an undercard wrestler in the area. Parisi suffered the heart attack eating breakfast as the local coffee shop where he has a routine started every day. Parisi broke into pro wrestling as a teenager for promoter Bert Ruby in Detroit in 1961, and in either his second or third match, faced Gino Brito, also known as Louis Sardon, who became later his best friend and frequent tag team partner around the world. The two left Detroit for Nashville working for Nick Gillis in 1962 and quickly won the tag team titles. By the standards of the time, Parisi was a high flyer utilizing drop kicks and a finishing maneuver called the cannonball, which was the same flying butt drop off the top rope that Matt Osborne used throughout his career, which was also Matt's father's finisher, and most notably as the original Doink the Clown in the WWF. He came to the WWF territory in 1965. As Antonio Pugliese, the first cousin of Sammartino, his role was to work high on the cards, often semifinals to Sammartino in the big cities, usually holding or challenging for the old U.S. Tag Team title. His frequent role was also the recipient of television beatings in angles with whomever they were grooming as the top heel at the time, to set Sammartino up with a grudge to gain revenge for his family. He started with a major push, most wrestling in the smaller cities in the main events as Sammartino's tag team partner to get the gimmick over. Sammartino then suggested on a TV angle that he form a tag team with Johnny Valentine, and in his second Madison Square Garden appearance on February 21, 1966, he and Valentine won the old U.S. tag titles from Bill and Dan Miller in 2 straight falls. He continued mainly working mid-card or higher at the Garden throughout the year. On September 24, 1966 at the TV tapings in Washington, D.C., Pugliese and Valentine's reign ended when Valentine turned on Pugliese for a second time. Valentine first turned on him at a house show in Baltimore, but the WWF ordered them as champions to still defend the belts in an angle, and they dropped them to Baron Michael Scicluna and Smasher Don Sloan. Valentine then left the territory before any program could take place. The tag titles were made something of an afterthought at this point. At the tapings on December 8, 1966, Pugliese and Miguel Perez were challenging new champs Baron Michael Scicluna and Smasher Don Sloan. Perez was injured in the match and couldn't continue after the second fall. This allowed Spiros Arion from Greece, in only his second match in the U.S., to be propelled into stardom as he replaced Perez and teamed with Pugliese to win the third fall and the titles. They continued as champs through the summer of 1967, when he left the WWF for Australia without dropping the belts, where he gained his greatest fame and income. Wrestling as Pugliese, he teamed with Mario Milano to first win the IWA World Tag Team titles from Brute Bernard and Skull Murphy on April 20, 1968 in Melbourne during the glory days of wrestling in Australia. He later held the belts once more with Milano, once with Dominic DeNucci and twice with Don Leo Jonathan before leaving in 1969. Bernard and Murphy remained his most frequent foes during the entire period, where he also worked tag teams against teams like Scicluna and Cyclone Negro, the Assassins Bill Miller and Killer Kowalski at Milano and Waldo von Erich. In San Francisco in 1971, he was a frequent tag team partner of Rock's father, Rocky Johnson, in a major program with Pat Patterson and Billy Graham over the NWA tag team titles in that region. He went back home, working for Pedro Martinez in the Buffalo/Cleveland area, and captured the old NWF tag team titles in 1972 with DeNucci as his partner, from Mitsu Arakawa and Yoshino Sato, who became better known a decade later as the Great Kabuki, and feuded over them with a version of the Fabulous Fargos, this time Don teaming with young wrestler Johnny Fargo, who later wrestled as Greg Valentine. Parisi and Luis Martinez also won those belts from the Fargos before losing to Jacques Rojo Sr. and area legend Johnny Powers. He returned to the WWF in 1975, teaming with Luis Serdon Brito, also billed as his cousin, but going by his real name and still as Sammartino's cousin, as a babyface team, winning the tag titles from Blackjack Lanza and Mulligan on November 11, 1975 at the TV tapings at the Philadelphia Arena before losing them on May 11, 1976 in the same building to the Masked Executioners, who were John Minton, Stud, and Killer Kowalski. He and Serdon were also kept strong with the heavily ethnic crowd that was routinely selling out Madison Square Garden for Sammartino in those days, working against the likes of Arion, Scicluna, Waldo von Erich, Ivan Koloff, Bugsy McGraw and Jerry Blackwell. His lone Madison Square Garden main event was set up on March 1, 1976 when heels Graham and Koloff destroyed the previously unbeaten duo in such a fashion that Sammartino did a run-in to save his cousin. This led to a March 29, 1976 show where Sammartino and Parisi beat Graham and Koloff via count out in the main event, before 21,004 fans. But Parisi was down to the second match on the card the next month and gone from the area within a few months. Perhaps his most bizarre moment in wrestling was being on the phone with the late Dave McKigney, an area independent promoter known as the Bearman for training wrestling bears, which at one point was something of an attraction in pro wrestling. Parisi was on the phone with McKigney when one of his bears got loose and killed McKigney's wife, and he heard the entire incident. His final major run was working out of Montreal in 1982 to 1984, again as a regular babyface tag team champion, holding the titles 3 times with Brito and once with Dino Bravo, battling Pierre Lefebvre with partners like Patterson, Billy Robinson, and Frenchie Martin, while continuing to wrestle on undercards for Jack Tunney in Toronto. In recent years, Parisi was one of the key men in charge of contacting old-time wrestlers for the annual Ilio Di Paolo show in Buffalo, New York, run by WCW, and had wrestled on some of the shows. Parisi is scheduled to be honored on the September 19th Fall Brawl pay-per-view at Marine Midland Arena in Buffalo. Parisi had a huge funeral on August 22 in Niagara Falls, attended by an estimated 400 to 450 people, mostly local businessmen and very few in the wrestling industry, with no WWF representation, limited to Billy Red Lyons, Wolfman Willie Farkas and Brito. Very little of note regarding the August 21st ratings, with Raw doing a 6.26 rating, 5.84 first hour, 6.65 second hour, and a 9.9 share. Nitro did a 2.63 rating, 2.83 first hour, 2.42 second hour, and a 4.2 share. The head-to-head audience was 9.7 million, which was a big increase from the previous week. Raw was paced by a 7.69 overrun for the Stephanie vs. Lita match, with Rock as referee and Triple H and Angle in the corner of Stephanie, and the Hardys with Lita. The other strong quarter was a 6.79 for the Dudleys vs. Angle and Triple H match, which went unopposed as Raw picked up 27% of the Nitro audience when the show went off the air. Nitro's main event of Storm and Jarrett vs. Rection and Awesome, along with the climax of the Goldberg-Scott Steiner angle with Booker, Nash and Rick Steiner all involved, drew at 2.80 final quarter as there was no overrun. Head-to-head figures saw Raw at 4.97, Rock, Foley, Angle, Triple H, Shane and Stephanie interview, to 2.65, Booker vs. Palumbo, Raw at 6.22, opening interview continues, Hardys vs. Dudleys, to 2.05, Abbott vs. Vampiro, Smiley vs. Chronic, Raw at 6.16, Venus and Stratus vs. Crash and Ivory, to 2.19, Nash vs. Vito. And finally Raw at 6.03, Rikishi vs. Kane, to 2.80. Weekend ratings for August 19th to 20th saw Livewire at 1.2, second highest rated show on USA All Day, Superstars at 1.3, seventh highest, which was actually the lowest rated show on the station between 10 a.m. and 9 p.m., and Heat drew its usual 2.67, highest rated show on station. WCW Saturday fell to an 0.6, but it really didn't matter because the decision regarding cancellation had been made a few days earlier. It was the lowest rated show on TBS from 6:30 a.m. through 4 a.m. the next day. SmackDown on August 17th did a 4.68 rating. Thunder on August 16th did a 2.30 rating, peaking early but dropping really badly in the second hour, which is an indication of audience dissatisfaction with the show, losing a whopping 27% of the audience from 10:15 to 10:45 p.m. ECW on TNN on August 18th drew its best mark in some time with a 1.00 rating and 1.9 share, easily the highest rated show on the station that day. The rating grew throughout the show, which indicates audience satisfaction, and peaked at 1.18 for the main event. Roller Jam did in 0.56 as a follow-up, which was the second highest rated show on the station. The August 15th 3-hour Galavision block drew a 1.5 Hispanic rating. New Japan Heavyweight Tournament history. New Japan's major singles heavyweight tournament was called the World League, the same name as the old JWA tournament founded by Rikidos in the late 50s was called. New Japan started its World League in 1974 and it kept that name until 1977. In 1978, when New Japan became affiliated with the World Wrestling Federation, the annual tournament was renamed the Madison Square Garden League, though 1982. In 1983, the tournament was renamed the IWGP Tournament, which first crowned the IWGP Heavyweight Champion, and later was used to determine the number one contender, through 1987, when it was dropped. In 1989, the tournament returned, this time named the World Cup because it used Japanese, Russian and American wrestlers until its last name change in 1991 when the G1 Climax tournament was created. 1974, Antonio Inoki won over Seiji Sakaguchi and Killer Karl Krupp. 1975, Inoki pinned Krupp. 1976, Sakaguchi beat Pedro Morales. 1977, Sakaguchi beat Masked Superstar. 1978, Inoki beat Andre the Giant. 1979, Inoki beat Stan Hansen. 1980, Inoki beat Hansen. 1981, Inoki beat Hansen. 1982, Andre pinned Killer Khan. 1983, Hulk Hogan beat Inoki. 1984, Inoki won via points. 1985, Andre won via points. 1986, Inoki beat Dick Murdoch. 1987, Masa Saito won via points. 1989, Riki Choshu pinned Shinya Hashimoto. 1991, Masahiro Chono pinned Keiji Muto. 1992, Chono pinned Rick Rude. Tournament was also to create a new NWA World Heavyweight Champion. 1993, Katsumi Fujinami beat Hiroshi. 1994, Chono beat Power Warrior Kensuke Sasaki. 1995, Muto pinned Hashimoto. 1996, Choshu beat Chono. 1997, Sasaki beat Hiroyoshi Tenzan. 1998, Hashimoto beat Kazuo Yamazaki. 1999, Manabu Nakanishi beat Muto. 2000, Sasaki beat Nakanishi. Mexico. Mil Mascaras, in a Gong magazine interview in the August 31st issue, said he would be following in the footsteps of Antonio Inoki, Jesse Ventura and Hiroshi in running for the Mexican Senate representing his home state of San Luis Potosi in the 2003 elections. This is not the first time he's indicated this. He said he would unmask when campaigning for the seat begins. He said he doesn't know if he'll retire from the ring or not if he's elected. He also said he had a strong offer and looks like he'll be going to the new Guas promotion. We should have a full report next week, but the August 4th EMLL pay-per-view was described as having a good mask match and everything was good, but nothing was on the level of the main event of the first pay-per-view. Then again, only 2 or 3 matches all year have been in the world. The August 18th Arena Mexico show saw Ultimo Guerrero and Rey Bucanero retain the CMLL tag titles, beating Mr. Niebla and Emilio Charles Jr. in the match originally scheduled for the August 4th pay-per-view, but Charles was injured. Gigante Silva was in again this week as the headliner and back on August 25th, teaming with Atlantis and Rayo de Jalisco Jr. against Los Hermanos Dinamita and Apollo Dantes on top. All Japan. There will be a ton of interest in the September 2nd Budokan Hall show, largely for the undercard match where Masahiro Chono debuts in All Japan rings facing Masa Fuchi. It appears the working idea is to do a match along the lines of Chono and Hiroyoshi Tenzan versus Toshiaki Kawada and Fuchi on the New Japan October 9th Tokyo Dome show, and that New Japan would send a singles representative to the Triple Crown in October and a tag team to the traditional All Japan Tag Team Tournament in late November and early December. Also on the September 2nd Budokan show will be Sedman and Johnny Smith and Mike Barton versus Taiokia Manukia Mossman, who started using this name on August 20th, and Jinsei Shinzaki and Muhammad Yone, Sabu versus Damien, and a main event with Steve Williams and Toshiaki Kawada versus Genichiro Tenryu and Stan Hansen. The general belief is Chono will score a win to set up the angle for Dome show, which was Chono and Kawada involved would be a huge deal. All Japan is tentatively planning a May 2001 Tokyo Dome itself, which would be predicated on the New Japan program getting hot, because the only match that could draw that big would be a Kawada singles bout against Muto or Hashimoto. The new tour opened on August 20th at Korakuen Hall before the usual sellout of 2,100 and featured an undercard angle to build up to a cooperation with Toryuman. In a Lucha Libre style match, Super Parka and Super Kalo beat Halloween and Damien. After the match, Toryuman grapples Susumu Mochizuki, Sushi Kanda and Masaaki Mochizuki came to the ring, and Masaaki Mochizuki grabbed the mic and said they could do better Lucha Libre than the Mexicans and challenged All Japan to use them in the future. Sabu returned on the show, pinning Shigeo Okamura using the Arabian Facebuster as a finish, which goes against the old All Japan style of not doing foreign object finishes. Manukia Mossman changed his ring name to Taiokia to team with Jinsei Shinzaki over Williams and Sedman, who looked poor in his Japanese debut. The main event was an attempt to make the colorless Mike Barton into a star as he teamed with Hansen and Johnny Smith over Kawada and Tenryu and Nobutaka Arai, in the main event with Barton pinning Kawada in 1749 for the first time. Pro Wrestling Noah. Masahito Kakihara surprisingly quit the promotion after doing an angle with Yoshinari Ogawa on the debut show. There are reports that Kakihara will go into shooting, either with Rings, Pancrase or Pride, which doesn't make much sense because he can do a lot better in pro wrestling doing a shooter gimmick than as a small guy actually having to shoot. Kakihara was originally from UWFI, which included both Kiyoshi Tamura and Kazushi Sakuraba, who have done very well in shoots, and he does have fast hands for a pro wrestler and submission background, but the size will work against him. They ran an angle on the August 19th show at Differ Ariake, forming a new heel group called No Fear, which was the name of the group, with Yoshihiro Takayama, Takawa Mori, who is now injured undergoing elbow surgery, which explains why this angle was done, and Satoru Asako. After a tag match where Jun Akiyama and Yoshinobu Kanemaru beat Takeshi Rikyo and Kena Kobashi, Akiyama, Kanemaru and Takeshi Morishima all attacked Kobashi. Tsuyoshi Kikuchi ran in to help Kobashi, and then Takayama and Asako helped Akiyama to make it a 5-on-2, and they all shook hands to form the new version of the group, mainly to push Akiyama, as they've done since the company opened 2 weeks ago. The show, which drew a sellout in the small building, drew a younger crowd than All Japan was drawing for its Tokyo dates. Misawa announced 3 tours between now and the end of the year. The December tour will feature a tournament to crown the company's first champion. Misawa also announced he would be scouting the Sydney Olympics for new prospects to bring into his company, saying he wants to start next year with 30 wrestlers on his roster. Right now he's got 23. Saw a tape of the first show on August 5th as a 1-week tape delayed pay-per-view. I guess the show should get a thumbs in the middle. Kind of disappointing, but I wouldn't call it bad. The new building comes across like a high-tech studio-like atmosphere. Korakuen Hall modernized, basically. Opener with Makoto Hashi vs Morishima was your typical one-star opener. Morishima needs to get in better shape if he wants to be a headliner. The second match with Rusher Kimura and Mitsuo Momota and Rikyo vs Eigen and Tsuyoshi Kikuchi and Jun Izumata was still mainly a comedy match, and it was way into the negative star range, -1.5. Just terrible. Kentaro Shiga and Masamichi Marufuji vs Masao Inoue and Yoshinobu Kanemaru was a 3 stars match. The Asako and Takayama Anamori lost to Kakihara, and Yoshinari Ogawa and Daisuke Ikeda started good, but in going 23-45, dragged a lot. Even when they picked things up and it got good, the crowd wasn't that into it. 2 3/4. Main event was solid work with Kobashi and Akiyama beat Misawa and Taue. Kobashi was not in good shape and couldn't move well after coming back way too fast from double knee surgeries, but still looked good. Nice story with Akiyama winning straight falls, but the crowd totally didn't expect either finish, as the first 2 minutes in was too fast, and the second came when everyone assumed Misawa and Taue would win the second fall to even things up. That hurt the match, but it was a good bout. The crowd heat was not what you'd expect for the debut show, and that's probably where the thumbs in the middle comes in. The guys in the main event worked very hard and the match built well and had no mistakes, but crowd didn't make the match seem as good as it was. 3.5. As the story goes, Motoko Baba wants to use Atsushi Onita, but Kawada is said to be against it. The October tour will include shows on October 8th at Yokohama Bunka Gym and October 11th in Nagoya at Aichi-ken Gymnasium, as well as major city debuts in Gunma, Hiroshima and Okayama, so this will be the promotion's first real test. The debuts on September 24th in Kyoto and September 25th in Osaka both sold out in 30 minutes when tickets were put on sale on August 19th. August 9th TV show drew a 2.8 rating for the first total Pone show. New Japan. Shinjiro Otani is on a leave for 6 months and apparently will be headed to Calgary to work under Joe Daigo. New Japan has for decades sent younger wrestlers to Daigo in Calgary, be given a new look so he can return, bulking up to work as a heavyweight, and be given a push. There is legit heat between Otani and Booker Riki Choshu, and at one point Otani nearly quit the promotion until Seiji Sakaguchi worked as the mediator in their hard feelings. Otani tried, like Chono has been so successful at, to turn the heat into a wrestling angle at the G1 tournament, but Choshu's reaction was that he wasn't going to have an angle dictated to him by Otani. New Japan held a press conference on August 23rd with Tatsumi Fujinami and Hashimoto. Hashimoto said that he'd like to return, except that he made a vow if he lost at the April 7th Tokyo Dome that he'd retire, and he lost. They seemed to be building toward his return at the October 9th Tokyo Dome, but it wasn't announced. The August 12th TV show and the August 13th TV special were covering the G1 tournament. They aired highlights from every match in the tournament. The tournament couldn't compare to its glory years, but it was still some of the best wrestling out of this company in a long time and probably compares favorably to a 5-show stretch for any promotion this year. Based on clips from the August 7th show in Osaka, which was much better at least from a crowd reaction standpoint than we were led to believe, Kenzo Suzuki vs Osamu Nishimura wasn't good at all, but a lot better than most Suzuki stuff. Kido vs Hiro Saito double countout was a terrible finish, which as you can imagine the fans hated. Iizuka vs Goto had good heat and a strong finish. Way better than expected. Koshinaka vs Yoshi was very good. Johnston vs Sasaki was very stiff, but the finish of Sasaki winning with the front guillotine submission came off too much as an Akiyama copy. Liger vs Fujinami was very good. Liger looks huge with no shirt on. Chono vs Takaiwa aired so little you couldn't tell a thing, which probably indicates it wasn't good. Tenzan vs Nakanishi was also very good. August 8th in Osaka didn't appear to be as good. Takaiwa vs Junji Hirata aired only clips, but what aired had real good heat. Johnston vs Saito seemed like a bad match with a good finish, teasing the double count out, but Johnston got a choke and dragged him into the ring. Fans, knowing Saito vowed to double count out every match, popped big for the finish in the middle. Yasuda vs Nishimura looked okay. Kojima vs Kido looked like a struggle by Kojima to get a match out of his 50-year-old foe. Iizuka vs Liger's finish was good and it appeared to be the best thing on the card. Fujinami vs Nagata didn't look that good and just emphasizes that Fujinami really should have retired years ago. Chono vs Yoshi at least had a nice finish and the crowd reacted to it well, which must be a good sign because the idea of Chono doing a 20-minute singles match as a main event these days is kind of scary. August 9th in Hiroshima was rushed through on TV. Only major notes were in the Sasaki vs. Saito double countout. Of course the fans hated the finish. I will say this much, the two wrestlers did a good job getting over the storyline of what was a terrible idea, but the finish still killed the match. While Suzuki vs. Nakanishi was better than expected, and clearly Suzuki is showing improvement, he kicked out of the German suplex finisher before the three which killed that finish. Liger's lone win over Goto didn't appear to be a good match, but the pop Liger got for the win was one of the biggest in the tournament. The Iizuka vs. Nagata match that was voted best of the week was a good match, but didn't look any better than some of the matches on the first night. Chono vs. Koshinaka seemed better than average. From August 11th at Sumo Hall, they showed little except finishes. It appeared Liger vs. Nagata and Sasaki vs. Kojima were good solid bouts, but nothing spectacular. For August 12th, there were some big pops because of upsets. Takaiwa's win over Koshinaka, which looked good, got one of the biggest pops of the tournament. Nakanishi vs. Yasuda had good heat but really wasn't that good of a match. Probably the biggest pop of all was Nishimura upsetting Tenzan, perhaps because fans take Nishimura as an upset because of the cancer. Goto's upset of Nagata was a simple 3-back suplexes, and didn't get as much of a pop. The Iizuka chokeout on Fujinami came out of nowhere and didn't appear to be much. For the August 13th final night, they aired the complete matches of all the G1 bouts and it was a really good show. Probably among the best major cards of the year. Iizuka vs. Nagata was an old school match but probably the best technical match of the year on TV. The mat work was better than the Benoit vs. Regal match at the Pillman show and had awesome subtleties with the wrestling. It's the kind of match a real serious fan would love, but I'm not sure a casual fan would like as much, but it was great for this audience. Iizuka won with a crossface, 4 stars. Nakanishi's win over Tenzan was boring early, but Tenzan carried it to a good match later on, with a big pop for the finish as Nakanishi hit Tenzan's own TTD, similar to a Michinoku driver initial stand for Tenzan tombstone driver, on him and then racked him for the submission. 3 stars. Sasaki then beat Nagata in one semifinal in 15-12 with a Northern Lights bomb. More old school mat wrestling, but Nagata may be the best wrestler in the business working that style. Highlight was Sasaki going for a scorpion deathlock and Nagata reversing it into a heel hook. 3.5. The only weak match was Nakanishi over Chono with the rack in 9:33. It was a simple basic match. Chono using a lot of STFs as well as the edge downward spiral. There was a gigantic pop when Nakanishi got the submission with the rack, 1.5. Final saw Sasaki over Nakanishi in 1942. This was a lot better than their IWGP title match. Power match early but it built well and the last 5 minutes were great. Considering who was involved, you couldn't ask for a better match. Nakanishi went for the rack several times. At one point there was a sequence of Nakanishi going for the rack, Sasaki in the rack choking him, and then Nakanishi getting out of the choke with a back suplex. Nakanishi also did a rack, and when Sasaki didn't submit, dropped him in a stomach block. Another rack attempt but this time Sasaki was up there forever and didn't submit and finally Nakanishi collapsed under the weight. Sasaki hit some lariats, followed by a Northern Lights bomb and Boston Crab. Damn good final. 3 3/4. The October tour will be October 12th to October 29th, which I believe will be the annual tag team tournament. The tour opens at the Osaka Namihaya Dome and ends at the Kobe World Hall. Other Japan notes. Atsushi Onita's latest retirement match will be September 24th at Differ Ariake, saying that before he retires he wants to do an explosive barbed wire match in Los Angeles, presumably for XPW, although we've also heard October as a possible timetable for that one taking place. Dos Caras Jr. made his pro debut on August 11th in Shimonoseki for one of the smaller indie groups in Japan, teaming with his namesake father to beat Azteca and Chiba. Caras Jr., 23, said to be 6'5" Jan. Second and 211 pounds, said that he had been training to compete in the Sydney Olympics as a heavyweight wrestler but something happened in France at a qualifying meet and Mexico apparently won't be sending a wrestling team. He said he'd held off going pro because of wanting to wrestle in the Olympics, but at this age, figures he can't wait 4 more years for another chance. Reports are that he looked very good for a first match. His uncle, Mil Mascaras, whose recent CMLL Japan tour was at first billed as his retirement tour, but the 62-year-old is one of those guys who will never retire, and to his credit, he's still doing the world's oldest plancha even on the recent tour, will be returning for the CMLL Japan promotion in February, billed as the 30th anniversary of his Japanese debut tour. The main events would feature 10-man tags with the entire family on one side, Mascaras, brothers Dos Caras and El Psicodelico and their respective sons Caras Jr. and Psicodelico Jr. The wrestler on the CMLL Japan tour as Mr. Cacao, not to be confused with the more well-known Super Cacao, is actually CMLL Japan owner Amamoto. Mascara's first tour was for the old JWA in February of 1971. Eagle Sawai won the LLPW title from Harley Saito on August 19 in Soka on a card headline, a mixed tag with the current Tiger Mask teaming with Rumi Kazama to beat original Tiger Mask, Satoru Sayama, and Shinobu Kondori when Sayama put over his protege. Their next major show is August 30th at Korakuen Hall, which will be both the 8th anniversary of the LLPW promotion as well as a celebration of the 20th year as a pro wrestler by Norio Tadano, who in her glory days in the 80s was well known as part of the Jumping Bomb Angels tag team. Tadano started in July of 1981. I guess in Japan, they hold anniversary parties 1 year early. Tadano and Saito will wrestle retired 80s women Miki Handa and Utako Hosuki. A new group called UWF will debut on September 2nd at Kawasaki with a one-night tournament that includes Yoshiaki Fujiwara, Kendo Nagasaki, Osamu Tashiakari, and Billy Scott. Hayabusa worked the August 19th Michinoku Pro main event in Yamagata teaming with Great Sasuke and Ricky Marvin over Fuerza Guerrera and El Gladiador, Fugaz in EMLL, and Rocky Santana. Michinoku ended its tour on August 20th in Sendai with Sasuke retaining the NWA middleweight title against Guerrera. After the match ended, Minoru Fujita and Gran Naniwa, who has been out of action for a year with an injury, hit the ring and told Sasuke they were quitting the company. Sasuke tried to talk them into staying. Robbie Brookside and James Mason from England worked the next MPW tour from September 9th to September 21st along with Grand Apache. They are also planning a tag team tournament for October, including October 8th debut at Differ Ariake. On the FMW show on August 20th at Differ Ariake, they had a singles match with Kota Fuyuki beating Masato Tanaka when a bunch of wrestlers from the Indie Social Pro Wrestling Federation interfered, so I guess they'll be working together. They did a losers get pies thrown in the face by the fans match on top with Goemon and Kentaro Kanemura and Mr. Ganasuke over Hisakatsu Oya and Hayabusa and Tetsuhiro Kuroda. Fuyuki said that if Yoshinobu Kanemaru and Masao Inoue of Pone don't set a date to defend the WEW tag titles that they won recently, they'd simply just drop the belts. Onryo, an indie wrestler with a pretty cool gimmick and lots of charisma, he does something akin to an Undertaker gimmick from about 8 years ago except does tons of high flying, is expected to join FMW in October. Kaoru Ito won the annual AJW Japan Grand Prix tournament on August 20th at Korakuen Hall before a near sellout of about 1,700 fans. Ito scored wins over Reggie Bennett, Tomoka Watanabe and finally Atsuko Mita in the finals to win the tourney and make her the top contender for Manami Toyota's WWA title. JWP held a benefit show for the family of the late Mariko Umeda, Plum Mariko, this past week. Umeda passed away on August 16, 1997 from brain injuries after being knocked out in a wrestling match. Abdullah the Butcher just returned to Big Japan after losing a loser leaves town match to Men's Teo a few months back. Here and there. This is a weird story, but this is what we're told is the truth about what is going to happen on August 26th in Knoxville. Supposedly, even though Ron Fuller and Terry Landell's groups agreed to work together for the benefit show, it is around town that Fuller is going to shoot on Landell. Now again, I won't believe it until it happens, but as the story goes, the challenge by Fuller came impromptu in a setting, at a press conference for a charity show where Landell had to agree to it. The feeling is that Landell won't show up and there are even rumors he said so himself, but he's been put in a position since he's been on TV challenging Fuller all summer, that he'd look terrible to not show up at a charity show. Fuller did a promo on his final show on August 18th saying he was 52 years old and hadn't wrestled in 12 years, mentioning how much older he was than Landell. On the show, the Georgia Jawjacker vs. Assassin match ended up with an assassin coming out and saying he was the brother of the real assassin, saying the Armstrong family had detained the real assassin. Bob won in 134 and unmasked the guy as Brian Wayne. The main event on the final show was Jimmy Golden win the USA title from Buddy Landell in just 2:40. Fuller announced after the show that since they had sold season tickets promising to run through September 1st, that they were refunding on the spot all season ticket holders money for the final 2 shows that aren't taking place, but they did offer to donate people's money who didn't want a refund to Brett Young, who is the 5-year-old that needs a bone marrow transplant because his immune system doesn't work. Jim Cornette is sending talent to the August 26th show, which has Mark Henry, Russ McCulloch and Robbie D from OVW. The cause of death of Mike Marcello, the Florida indie wrestler who passed away on August 15th, was suicide. The NWA ran the Fort Homer Hesterly Armory in Tampa on August 15, drawing 758 fans for a show that honored Cowboy Luttrell, Eddie Graham, Duke Kyomika, Boris Malenko, Al Costello, Rick Rude, Marcelo, Hiro Matsuda, Gordon Soley, Johnny Valentine, Danny Miller, Carl von Stroheim, Dory Funk Sr. and Tony Marino. Rick Michaels and David Young won the NWA tag titles on the show from Curtis Thompson and Drake Dawson, although apparently it was a fake Drake Dawson who was pinned. They return on September 19th with an 8-man tournament for the vacant NWA heavyweight title with Dan Severn, Gary Steele, Chris Harris, Kevin Northcutt, Greg Valentine, Joe Malenko and 2 others, plus Brian Blair versus Steve Kieran in a first blood match. Kieran turned on Blair on this show, and Dory Funk wrestling his top protege, Adam Windsor from England. IWA in Puerto Rico is attempting to syndicate its show into the United States on the Telemundo network starting in September. It appears it'll be on a very late time slot on weeknights. Bill Dundee announced his retirement on the August 19th Memphis TV show. Dundee said that in his day, he and George Barnes, who he came to Memphis with nearly 25 years ago, were the best at fighting, but today's wrestling is mostly show business. He said he returned to just do a little show business and introduced a new trainee, Corey Jackson. Of course, this led to an angle where all the heels attacked Jackson and locked Dundee and the rest of the faces out of the building. Wolfie D is now known as Slash, the same name he's using in Louisville. Rena Mero was on Inside Edition this past week. They noted that the TV series she was supposed to star in with Dennis Rodman called The Consultants is already history before the first episode got on television. She mainly plugged her book. Tammy Sitch on her website said she was in an accident when her Jeep rolled over twice and her face and neck got cut up from the windshield. Joe Pedicino and Bonnie Blackstone will revive their 80s Pro Wrestling This Week TV show in radio form on the Fox Radio Sports Network every Sunday from 10 a.m. to noon Eastern Time starting on September 3rd. The proposed Pro Wrestling Hall of Fame in Schenectady, New York is being planned for a fall 2001 opening. MMA. UFC got an experimental approval with the New Jersey Athletic Commission. The IFC will be running in Atlantic City first in a few weeks. UFC has a tentative plan, which hasn't been finalized, of running November 17th from the Taj Mahal in Atlantic City. Cyril Abidi of France apparently proved his win over Peter Aerts was no fluke as he scored a second win at the K1 World Grand Prix tournament at the Yokohama Arena before 15,200 fans, knocking Aerts, who many feel is the best heavyweight kickboxer in the world, out of the 8-man tournament in his first match. The show drew a 15.9 rating for the taped replay of the show later that evening on the Fuji network, with the rating peaking at a 21.4. Aerts' corner threw in the towel in 2:24 when Aerts was complaining of low back pains. Abidi won his second-round match over Ray Sefo, who was bleeding badly, and it was stopped. Francisco Filio beat Abidi in the tournament final. Naoto Morishita said this past week that DSE is wanting to use Frank Shamrock but that he's asking for Rickson Gracie money. He said they want him, but not with that kind of price tag. DSE is also back trying to put together a Naoya Ogawa vs Nobuhiko Takada match, which would be a big ticket seller. They tried to do the match last year but it fell apart because it was going to be a worked match and Takada wouldn't agree to put Ogawa over. The idea is to build Ogawa up as a killer and the Great Japanese Hope, Japan's version of the former Great White Hope theory of drawing huge money in heavyweight boxing dating back to the Jack Johnson days and most recently manipulated with Jerry Cooney nearly 2 decades back, for a match next year with Rickson Gracie as the ultimate match of the century type deal. This would get very tricky being that we're not aware of Rickson Gracie ever doing a work, but because Ogawa is being manipulated into a spot as the biggest pro wrestling star in Japan, they can't risk a poor showing in a shoot for him. New Japan's Don Frye and Brian Johnston were giving last week training to Kazuyuki Fujita, Tokumitsu Ishizawa and Sakuraba for the August 27th Seibu Dome Pride show for their respective top 3 matches on the show against Ken Shamrock, Ryan Gracie and Henzo Gracie respectively. In what sounds like a pro wrestling freak show angle, Kazuyoshi Ishii, the K1 promoter, claims to have found a German giant from prison who is 6'10" Jan. 2nd and 330th pounds, who is 22 years old and will debut on the December 10th K1 Tokyo Dome show as a masked man. Ishii said that he wanted to bring the man to the upcoming Pride and New Japan Tokyo Dome shows for a challenge to Fujita. ECW. There is nothing new from the TV front other than rumors have an 11 p.m. to 1 a.m. Saturday night time slot as a most likely scenario. The positives are that content issues wouldn't be as big a deal during that time slot. From the August 19th ECW Arena show. The show opened with ref Danny Daniels playing heel, claiming Lynn injured him and was trying to collect the bounty on him. Lynn punched in. Rhino speared Lynn through a table, but Lynn came back and used the cradle piledriver on his opponent, Elvis Wesley. Daniels then DQ'd him. Lynn then went to piledrive Daniels, but Prodijet stopped him, so for the misogynistic audience, he got the bigger pop by piledriving the woman. Corino beat Anton in a match where Cyrus interfered, but victory went face with Corino to stop Cyrus. Chetty and Nova beat Julio De Niro and Chris Hamrick in a bout with a lot of cool-looking moves and no psychology. De Niro and Hamrick worked well in their role. Guido and Mamaluke beat York and Matthews in a spot fest. Matthews was limping back to the dressing room. A guy at ringside during the open had a sign saying Spice-Go, sick, and 10A are better than Styles. Styles made fun of the guy, saying he should go to a comic book store and find an old wrestling magazine to learn how to spell Zabishko. Francine claims Sandman injured her the previous night and she wanted revenge. Tao beat Psychosis in what we're told was the second best match in the ECW arena over the last 4 years, behind only the Mysterio Jr. vs. Juventud Guerrera match with the Hurricane Rana off the car. Apparently their first singles match the night before in Virginia Beach wasn't that good, which panicked Tao, who stayed up all night coming up with a match since he knew a bad match at the arena could kill the program. Pat Tanaka returned and attacked Tao afterwards, which set up a singles match where Whipwreck beat Tanaka. Lou E. Dangerously came out with Elektra. Blue Boy and Jasmine St. Clair came out. Dangerously said St. Clair had a better body than Elektra and started calling Elektra a hole and a slut. She went after Dangerously, so St. Clair and Blue Boy attacked her. Jazz then gave St. Clair an X Factor, but Blue Boy attacked her until Gary Wolf made the save. Segment was said to be totally dead. During and Roadkill and Dreamer beat Anderson and Diamond and Swinger. Highlight was Roadkill doing the Hogan flexing pose. Baldies, Red Dog, Balls Mahoney and finally Bobby Eaton all did run-ins after the match. Cyrus came out noting that ECW on TNN would soon be a memory. Chilly Willy gave Cyrus the Michinoku driver. Van Dam and Cash beat Rhino and Credible in the main event. Sandman, who was injured thus couldn't wrestle on the show, did a run-in and he and Credible traded cane shots. Corino gave Rhino the super kick to set up Van Dam using the Van Terminator to pin Rhino, and Rhino and Sandman drinking beer together to end the show. Told the main event was very good, but aside from that and the Tao match, which made the show, nothing else was anything out of the ordinary. Sandman wasn't believed to be injured seriously in a messed up spot from the night before in Virginia Beach, Virginia. The idea was that Sandman was going to do the Frankensteiner off the top onto Rhino, but that Francine was to hook Sandman's leg and Rhino would then turn it into a power bomb off the ropes through a table. Because Sandman is too heavy to have that spot pulled off easily, they lost their balance and tumbled to the floor. Sandman took a pretty bad bump to the floor, and on the way over, Francine got kicked in the face and she ended up with a black eye. They acknowledged that at the arena, basically doing the storyline that Sandman had injured her. The August 25th and August 26th shows at the Hammerstein Ballroom in New York are expected to sell out at $2,500 paid per night. Blue Meanie and Jasmine St. Clair aren't married. She called it into a website, but now the story has changed and it was hacked into the website or something. WCW. Nitro on August 21st in Wichita, Kansas was a lot better show, particularly when it came to flow and pacing, and a main storyline that actually created heels and faces and built the main event matches for the next pay-per-view. Skipper kept the Cruiserweight title, beating Loco with the CFL ring finish. Goldberg and Russo did an angle where Goldberg was offered a release where he'd get all his money and have a chance to go to WWF. He ripped it up. You know that's a work, since Goldberg was reported in the Charleston Post-Courier in Mike Mooniham's column as saying if that was offered to him that he'd take it and leave. Steiner then showed up at the hotel and threatened to do bodily harm to Goldberg's girlfriend, actually an actress. The angle began to unravel for two reasons. First is that Russo dared Goldberg to hit him because if he did he'd be fired. Goldberg then backed off. However, Russo said in the same angle he couldn't fire Goldberg because he had a no-cut contract, which is why Goldberg would have to sign a release. Then Booker came out and laid out Russo with a kick that missed. So why can Booker attack Russo but not Goldberg? Cajun and Guns beat Kiwi and Paisley in the typically bad match with women who looked terrible trying to wrestle, attempting to do high spots. Abbott sang horribly with 3 count in the background. Abbott blamed their background vocals for why it was so bad. I think I've seen that a million times in sitcoms. Vampiro and ICP and Muta came out and attacked 3 count and Abbott. Vampiro held the JCW belt from the ICP's house shows that actually sell tons more videos than WCW ever could. They tried to play it was a fake ECW invasion angle, complete with Madden trying to get a JCW chant. Mike Sanders did a hell of a promo trying to get over himself. Palumbo, Stasiak, O'Hare, Jindrak and Reno as the natural-born thrillers. Sanders did a hell of a promo considering his experience level while again burying how bad the company is. The FAs came out as faces and a commercial aired. When they came back, they had a six-man with O'Hare and Jindrak and Sanders beating Mysterio Jr. and Guerrera and Disco in 8-10. Really good match, particularly Guerrera, who looked the best he has in months and probably the best in the ring. Almost anyone from WCW has looked in about that same length of time, actually making everyone and himself look good. Mysterio Jr. was also good, while O'Hare early was all over the place. Sanders pinned Disco with a form of a neckbreaker. Conan and Stasiak were on commentary and they were entertaining. Actually, it was hilarious when Stasiak got down on Conan for not wrestling and Conan said how everyone knows he just had tricep surgery. The funny thing is, nobody knows that his fans see the guy come out week after week and the announcers never make any reference as to why he's never wrestling or why his arm some weeks is all taped up. O'Hare did a swanton on Tigress after the match. Palumbo actually pinned Booker T to win the title in a match with Russo as heel ref. Very good heat, but Palumbo looked bad. All the thrillers were interfering, which brought out Vito and Nash. Nash turned on Booker with a chair leading to Palumbo scoring the pin. Miller then said he had the same power as Russo, said he was given power by Bischoff, and told Russo to write himself to the back and gave the belt back. Of course T refused and they restarted the match with Booker winning in 52 seconds. It should be noted that Goldberg arrived at his hotel room before the match started, and here, some 15 minutes later, had just finished climbing the stairs to get to her room. I think he should have used the elevator because it sure gave Steiner plenty of time to take the elevator and get back to the building, and the room was empty. Vampiro NC Tank when Tank KO'd Vampiro and ref Charles Robinson. ICP who were amusing doing commentary, at least at first, and Muta came in with Muta blowing mist and the music just played. 3 Count tried to save Tank but he still didn't like them. Smiley beat Chronic in a handicap match for the hardcore title when the Harris twins interfered. The gimmick was Smiley wanted to lose the title so booked himself in a bout he couldn't possibly win. Of course, that doesn't explain why he just didn't lay down. Chronic themselves didn't like the idea, this as a shoot, of both coming out and losing, so Adams came out in street clothes and did commentary. There was a lot of backstage double standard talk since Chronic are sort of Russo's pets, being that when Luger didn't want to do Russo's angles he sent him home, but when Chronic doesn't, they can get away with it routinely. Adams did interfere doing a full Nelson slam and Clark did the meltdown. Harris twins came in and hit both with chairs and put Clark through a table and Smiley fell on him for the pin. Smiley acted like he was mad he won. That really puts the belt over. Nash beat Vito via DQ when Booker interfered. They did a vignette with Vito and Russo where they acknowledged that Vito was Russo's friend, true, and that Vito was in WCW because the WWF wanted nothing to do with him. That's really cool, getting your product over by saying you're a bunch of guys the other guys don't want. Anyway, Nash sold for Vito and even gave him near falls and let him kick out of a choke slam and side slam. This was the big push for Vito match, but Nash still power bombed him once. When he went for the second one, T interfered. Fans booed T saving Vito, which wasn't the idea. Storm and Jarrett beat Rection and Awesome in a match where Storm could lose the US Canadian title if anyone in the match, including his partner, now try and make sense out of that, pinned him. Skipper interfered on Rection for a false finish. The idea of the finish is Jarrett hitting Awesome with a guitar shot when Storm moved, but the execution as it pertained to appearing like Jarrett was going to hit Storm and him moving wasn't there. Finally the show ended with Scott Steiner kidnapping Beth the actress. Goldberg came out. Jarrett nailed him with a chair shot and they doubled on him. Booker came out, but Nash attacked Booker. Goldberg by this point was making his own comeback until Rick Steiner hit T and Goldberg with a pipe and both were handcuffed to the corner while Scott put the girlfriend in the recliner. It was a good angle in that it made sense for building the pay-per-view, but fans have to be scratching their heads after building up Nash against Scott all last week to see Nash helping Scott with no storyline reason, let alone T helping Goldberg who he was just running down in every interview. The KISS, keep it simple stupid, principle is that for wrestlers to draw money, fans have to be able to have an emotional involvement in their characters. If their characters are wishy-washy, changing their personalities and their friends on a weekly basis, there is no emotional response to them. Notes from the TV tapings on August 22nd in Tulsa. Worldwide was headlined by Mysterio Jr. and Guerrera over Moore and Helms. For Thunder, Kiwi beat Cajun with Guns and Paisley having a pull-apart. They had a brawl with Vito and FAs against Thrillers. They have a new guy as a takeoff on Just Joe stirring up trouble with Kat and Disco. Crowbar is in love with Daphne and she comes in saying how much fun she had with her secret admirer, and he was crushed. Harris twins beat Young Dragons. Chronic chased Harris twins into the crowd and Leah Meow came out and hooked up with Dragons. I Am Smooth talks Smiley into an I Quit match for the title where Smiley can just say I quit and get rid of the belt. Reno beat Crowbar when Daphne's admirer comes and she leaves, causing Crowbar to be distracted as lose. Midaja does an interview with 10A starting the Jim Gray/Pete Rose angle and going heel. ICP and Muda and Vampiro beat 3 Count and Abbott when 3 Count turned on Abbott and attacked him with wiffle ball bats. In reality, 3 Count had been begging to get Abbott away from their act because they mixed together like oil and water. Smiley beat Smooth because he got laryngitis and couldn't say I quit. I know what you're thinking, why didn't he just tap out? But no, that wouldn't be funny. So since he can't, when Smooth was saying, say I quit to Smiley, the ref ruled it as an I quit and raised Smiley's hand. Paisley beat Guns when Tigress interfered. They did an angle where everyone wants Disco fired leading to Sanders beating him. Storm won a 3-way over Awesome and Rection to keep the title. Nash and Palumbo NC Booker and Vito when Jarrett and Thrillers all attacked Vito. Stacy Keebler and David Flair's TV wedding looks to take place in October, which coincides with the return of Rick. Lots of talk that the story will end up with Rick as the father of the child in the attempt to copy the Stephanie/Triple H angle. Some notes from the August 15th Thunder tapings. The reason they had one of the long delays and Storm wrestled twice is because it was originally booked as Cat pinning Jacques Rougeau clean, and Rougeau refused to do the job and quit the company. Rougeau even got a story in the papers in Montreal where he claimed he told Russo specifically that he wouldn't come back to be a jobber. Rougeau, 43, has that old school attitude about doing jobs on television, meaning you can't be a money player, and didn't want to be involved. A lot of the wrestlers were laughing at him brag about how he recently beat King Kong Bundy at halftime of a CFL football game, and how he had pinned Hulk Hogan a few years ago in a match he promoted in Montreal, as if Bundy was still a big name. Storm bruised his ribs in the 6-man earlier in the show, but worked the second time anyway. The guy listed as Adam Pringle who lost to Crowbar was actually Brett Como, who at one point worked in Japan and feuded with Ultimo Dragon, so he's an experienced guy with talent, which explains why they had the best match on the show. The Mad Jack who wrestled Vampiro was also a guy who used to work regularly in Japan as Dr. Luther, Len St. Clair. The 4 guys Chronic wrestled, which did air on Thunder itself, were Michelle Starr, Juggernaut, Rockford 2000 and Ladies' Choice, all wrestlers from Extreme Canadian Championship Wrestling. Billy Kidman will be out a few weeks as he injured his larynx doing the hanging angle with Shane Douglas. Sean Stasiak didn't do a run-in on Thunder with Chuck Palumbo and Reno because it was feared in a worldwide taped match that he had blown out his knee doing a spot with Kaz Hayashi. Last report seems to be that he suffered a partially torn ACL and he's not sure if he's going to need to undergo surgery. Nash was backstage politicking to get the title at the pay-per-view, saying that Booker isn't as over as a champ needs to be since Nash gets cheered no matter how they script the confrontations between the two of them. The general feeling is he's not wrong in that regard, but that his motivations for saying it are self-serving. Super Crazy has expressed interest in getting into WCW since nothing has happened with ECW, but the timing doesn't appear to be right. It's funny, with WCW is such need of good talent, and a guy who has proven he can be a pretty big star already in this country and who is a tremendous worker and no doubt will work cheap by the standards of the WCW pay structure wants to come in, and they aren't interested in him, and you think if a white guy who did so well in ECW and had his talent and wanted to come in, that WCW, even with cost-cutting going on, would have no interest. The Mark Madden as a wrestler angle has been dropped. The original idea was to have Madden wrestle women, starting with Pamela Paulshock. Russo actually had the idea for Madden versus women to be a shoot, as Andy Kaufman's matches with women for the most part were, with exceptions. Juventud Guerrera has been offered a new contract. We don't have the details other than it's a very low guarantee as compared with what the current pay scale is, but his timing in when his deal comes for renewal isn't the best. It amounts to close to $2,000 per show, which if he gets a full schedule and the company goes back to a full schedule, theoretically can be called a raise, but realistically on 5 shows per month, and no guarantee he'd be on every one of them, it isn't. Although he's talented and ECW would definitely take him, although for far less money, there is some question if WWF has any real interest in him because of his size, and even if they took him, if he'd be pushed any different than Essa Rios, which still makes him staying the best bet. Even though Christina Lawn, Leia Meow, hasn't been used for months and isn't under contract, She was never fired because she had filed a complaint on a wrestler's alleged improper behavior to human resources at Turner, so the company felt it couldn't fire her. Carl Ouellet won't be around for several weeks until his visa gets taken care of. Mighty Heidi Collins has been released. There is a general belief that the tag title change from Chronic to Muta and Vampiro was largely because Chronic wasn't thrilled with the idea of dropping the tag titles to Mysterio Jr. and Guerrera, who had been promised the belts in exchange for getting punked by all the other teams in the build-up to the last pay-per-view. Booker T made these comments in the Charleston Post-Courier about Nash potentially leaving. Let him go. You think he can go up there and run with those young guys? You think you could run all around the building with Triple H like they do up there and take suplexes on the walkway? These guys aren't capable of doing that stuff anymore. These guys have nowhere to go, and if they can keep working WCW like they can, WCW is stupid. And that's the bottom line. If they want to go, let them go. I would never want to knock anyone for being honest in an interview, because more often than not, you don't get that. But from a business standpoint, what does it say about your product when the guy you're facing in the next pay-per-view main event you're also saying couldn't even hang with the guys in the competition? I think part of the WCW problem, as has been mentioned, is the negative spin WCW puts on WCW all the time. WCW is portrayed on its own programming constantly, dating back to probably late 1996, as a loser organization. Longtime fans that are left are made to feel like dolts for having supported the group, as opposed to feeling that for whatever reason, they were supporting a company that in some form they liked more than the other guys. I mean, even today, in head-to-head tests on Monday nights, there are still about 28% of the fans who prefer WCW, which isn't enough to make money, but it's also enough that you don't want to go on your own show and continually talk about how bad you were to that audience, particularly when more often than not, the war period was better than the now period in the average fan's mind, being the ratings are going southward. WCW has also banned all wrestlers from doing any media interviews without company approval. WWF just recently also adopted that same policy. At this point, the plan is for the 4 shows being taped in Australia to have only Shivani and Madden as announcers, and they'll be the only ones brought on the trip. WCW is planning on changing the names of many of the pay-per-view shows in 2001, perhaps as many as 8 or 9, but keeping Starrcade, Halloween Havoc and probably Bash at the Beach. Thunder on August 15th in Kamloops, BC drew 2,543, paying $85,668. House Show on August 18th in Mankato, Minnesota drew 822, paying $18,315. House Show August 19th in Sioux City, Iowa drew 2,259, paying $52,615. August 20th in Topeka, Kansas drew 1,741, paying $37,968. Nitro on August 21st in Wichita, Kansas drew 4,254 in the building and 2,294 paid for a $70,654 house. At the house shows, 3 Count vs. Young Dragons was reported as the show stealers, which is no surprise. Muta was said to be limping so badly his leg was dragging. Luger worked both house shows, now with short blonde hair and got no pop since nobody knows what to make of him. He worked both nights as a face, first losing to Douglas and then losing in a tag match with Demon against Muta and Vampiro. The 3-way with Mysterio Jr. and Guerrera, Chronic and O'Hare and Jindrak had Palumbo as ref. Chronic scored a pin and apparently won the title, but then after the pin, Palumbo DQ'd them doing the Dusty finish and awarded the bout back to the FAs. Sioux City was killed by the Goldberg-Steiner match. Steiner did several minutes of mic work running down the people to turn heel and then challenged Goldberg. Goldberg came out, all bandaged up, and attacked him. They never got in the ring, brawled in the aisle and out the exit, and before it had apparently started, it was over, ruled a double count out. Fans were furious at this, and even though Jarrett and Booker went on next and had a solid main event, fans pelted the ring with garbage at the end of the show. One has to question who came up with the idea for that, and even question anyone involved in the booking process on the shows for allowing something that the paying customers would so obviously feel is a ripoff when the company is in such poor shape, and if anything, everyone involved, including the wrestlers, need to either be working extra hard to turn things around. The reason given is that it was presented as an impromptu brawl as opposed to a match, but fans didn't take it that way. WWF King of the Ring as a pay-per-view appears to have come in slightly below the original projections at just over 400,000 buys, with Rock and Undertaker and Kane vs. Vince and Shane and Triple H, or roughly the same level as the Rock vs. Triple H 60 Minutes match pay-per-view did. The early projections for the July pay-per-view, headlined by Rock vs. Benoit, are that it'll do slightly better than the two previous shows. Even if it stays even or declines slightly, for a variety of reasons, that has to be considered a pretty big success and shows at this point there is no risk in mixing up the characters on top and mixing new people in, and it's the mixing new people in that gives the company depth and more long-term possibilities. Added to SummerSlam are Shane vs. Blackman for the hardcore title, Goodfather and Richards and Buchanan vs. Too Cool and Rikishi, and the Chyna and Guerrero vs. Venus and Stratus match now has the IC title at stake if Chyna or Guerrero score a pinfall, as well as Kat vs. Terry in some sort of stink face stipulation match. One can certainly see the signs of a potential storyline where Triple H and Stephanie split up, with Stephanie aligning with Angle, and Chyna and Guerrero splitting up, linking Chyna back with Triple H since the public seems to want that anyway as a strong babyface pair. Raw on August 21st in Lafayette, Louisiana opened with great heat for a Rock promo and everyone else came out and they set up the show. Hardys beat Dudleys when Edge hit Bubba with a chair and Jeff pinned him in the best match. Venus and Stratus beat Ivory and Crash when Venus used the screwdriver on Ivory and Stratus pinned her. Chyna attacked Venus after the match. Rikishi beat Kane via DQ for chair shots. Triple H and Angle beat Acolytes. Jericho beat Saturn via DQ when Benoit attacked Jericho. The hardcore title match with Shane vs. Blackman ended up with Test, Albert, Edge and Christian all attacking and laying out Blackman. Shane finally came in and scored the pin with a kendo stick to the head. Foley then ruled Shane would have to defend the title at SummerSlam against Blackman. Shane got so scared he wanted to lay down and let Edge or Christian have the belts and had them cover him. Foley counted to 2, then said he was waiving the 24/7 rule until after the pay-per-view. Terry attacked Kat at WWF New York and gave her the stinky face. Edge and Christian NC Dog and X-Pac when Dudleys came in. This was very strange. They announced during this match X-Pac vs. Dog at SummerSlam. Then a few minutes later, after the match the two argued and X-Pac headbutted Dog, who fell backwards through a table. X-Pac seemed remorseful at what he'd done. Wouldn't it have made more sense to do the angle and then later announce the match, because this way the angle came off too forced and contrived. Finally Lita beat Stephanie to win the women's title. This went 5:06, which meant the fact Lita is only good doing high spots and Stephanie has no business wrestling on TV was shoved down everyone's throat. It was like Major Guns and Miss Hancock on the WCW pay-per-view but without the clothes tearing and the mud. Stephanie, to her credit, tried to do high spots, and once nearly killed herself going over on a Hurricane Rana by Lita. Triple H, Angle and Hardys were all at ringside. Angle tried to interfere but Rock took care of him. Triple H came in after Rock. Angle ran in with the belt to hit Rock, who moved, so he hit Angle. Rock laid out Triple H and Angle and then gave Stephanie a spinebuster to allow Lita to score the pin after a moonsault, which got a pretty big pop. August 22nd tapings in New Orleans for SmackDown saw Rikishi beat Goodfather. The two hoes are now with Rikishi and Too Cool and they all danced together after the match. Blackman and Guerrero and Chyna beat Tanda and Stratus when Venus interference backfired, and he KO'd Test for Blackman to get the pin. They did a parking lot angle with Ross, Taz, and Lawler. Taz spray painted 13 on Lawler's car. Taz trapped Ross in his car and smashed the windows with a pipe. Ross was covered in blood and Lawler and Taz fought. Undertaker beat Dog and X-Pac. X-Pac spit on Taker's bike when the match started. Dog walked out on his partner leaving X-Pac to be pinned with the last ride. Saturn beat Snow due to distraction from Terry to keep the European strap. Hardys and Jericho beat Edge and Christian and Benoit when Jericho pinned Edge. Dudleys came out and brawled with Inc. and Hardys while Benoit and Jericho brawled. The main event was Rock and Lita against Stephanie, and either Triple H or Angle. She couldn't decide who her partner would be, so she flipped a coin and Angle won. Stephanie was then knocked out on the steps. Triple H came out and carried her off. Triple H later attacked Rock and KO'd the ref for a DQ. Angle and Triple H surrounded Lita but Hardys came out and attacked them. Rock then made a comeback on Angle and Triple H. Angle walked off from Rock, leaving Triple H with Lita, Hardys and Rock gave him the rock bottom and people's elbow. Angle and Stephanie kissed for about 10 seconds afterwards, although Stephanie acted shocked. They did a big thing after the show went off with Triple H teasing a face turn and the crowd cheering like crazy for him, but he eventually turned on the crowd so Rock left him laying with the rock bottom. A poll conducted by Kohl's department store of teenagers going back to school revealed that if they had the chance for a celebrity to substitute Teach, who would they pick? Of the boys, Rock got 38% to 19% for Britney Spears and Tiger Woods. Rock didn't make the list for women, headed by NSYNC, Julia Roberts, and Joshua Jackson. Add Venus Essa Rios, Taka Michinoku to the September 30th IWA show in Puerto Rico with the Benoit vs. Jericho main event. Big Show's MRI showed a herniated disc in his lower back. He's out of action recuperating, so his stint at Ohio Valley has been delayed, but he'll be sent to Louisville upon recovery and won't be brought back to WWF until his conditioning is at what they believe to be an acceptable level. At press time, the three-judge Court of Appeals had not made a ruling on USA Network's appealing the decision that allowed Raw and the rest of the WWF package to move to TNN and MTV. There is a feeling that if the judge rules in favor of USA Network, that WWF would make out even better because they could open up the contract talks with both sides and strike a better deal from Viacom, which USA would then have to match. The worst-case scenario would be WWF remaining on USA with its rights fees being up from $5.5 million to $28 million annually for the 4 shows. Rupert Murdoch was quoted this week as saying that he wasn't opposed to the idea of negotiating a deal with Viacom to where he'd become partners in UPN, which would keep the network afloat since Murdoch's News Corporation bought the UPN affiliates in New York, Los Angeles and San Francisco, which at this point would leave UPN crippled come January. WWF officials aren't overly concerned because of the success of SmackDown. UPN went under. The belief is it would make SmackDown a free agent show and there would likely be interest in the show from stronger networks looking for the elusive young male demo, and if anything, the show would pull bigger numbers, for example, if it moved to Fox or CBS. Dave Heckner got out of the hospital on August 17th. Raw is being moved to 11 p.m. Eastern Time for August 28th and September 4th due to the U.S. Open tennis coverage on USA Network, which has of late been a pet peeve of the WWF since the US Open will probably do about 1/4 the audience of Raw in that slot. On the West Coast, Raw will air at its regular 9 p.m. time slot. Tiger Ali Singh has been sent to Memphis. The Rock, People's Camp Video was back at number 1 in the sports rec charts this past week, beating out the 2000 NBA Finals at number 2. WWF had spots 3 through 6 with Eve of Destruction, Rock, Know Your Role, Austin vs. McMahon and Insurrection. Juggalo Championship Wrestling was number 8 and XPW was number 13, plus XPW debuted a second video at number 14. WWF had 14 of the top 20. Austin made a surprise appearance with Deborah and Jim Ross at WWF New York on Thursday. Austin and Deborah are scheduled to be married over the next few weeks. Rock got some press saying he was thinking about running for president someday. Rock was also named by Access Hollywood as one of the 10 biggest celebrities of 2000. WWF released a promotional poster for its pay-per-view shows over the next year to cable companies. Rock was positioned as the big star, to no surprise, with Triple H and Austin sharing the second level. Interesting is that Stephanie McMahon was positioned as the 4th biggest star in the company in the poster. TV Guide ran another 4-cover feature with Angle, Rikishi, Kat, and Jericho. They had the requisite WWF puff piece, which was accurate in the broad sense as far as what wrestling is, but pretty damn bad as far as details. They now credit, and this is the revisionist history version, of McMahon taking pro wrestling to this new level largely through the admission that it wasn't real sport. Vince himself made the claim that was responsible, saying, "There's no question about that, repositioning was the turning point. Because our view of the business was, let's go tell the public what this really is or, more specifically, what it is not. And then once you say you're in entertainment, it allows you to entertain in a much broader spectrum that you could before when you were quasi-sport." Still, as late as 1992, McMahon said to me that the big difference between the two of us in our positioning of pro wrestling is that he would never admit to the public what wrestling is, and my positioning of it was wrong because it told the public there is no Santa Claus. Of course, the problem with admitting in 1989 to the New Jersey legislature, and never on their own in a public forum until a few years later, that it wasn't sport is that it's hard to credit that to an overall industry boom that started years earlier, probably between the years 1982 and 1985, to that. Then again, if McMahon could have been indicted by the U.S. government and tried for a count of distributing steroids to Hulk Hogan on October 18, 1989 from a package first mailed by Dr. George Zarian to McMahon on October 24, 1989, I guess anything is possible. Kat's career was listed as briefly appearing for the NWA before signing with the WWF, which I guess should make Howard Brody happy for the brand name exposure. The only funny thing was them claiming they script out the matches 6 months ahead of time. Now that's a good one. They may have vague big show main event ideas that far ahead, but with injuries turns new ideas, etc. Ideas that far out are changed so often that they are never there when they get there. The SummerSlam main event itself changed several times over the past few weeks alone. Triple H was on Conan O'Brien on August 17th, mainly plugging the pay-per-view. There is some talk of SmackDown being available in Canada this coming season on Headline Sports. Raw in the UK was the highest-rated show on the entire Sky Sports network with 400,000 viewers for the week ending August 13th. SmackDown drew 240,000. Sunday Night Heat is on Channel 4, which is a major broadcast station available in far more homes than Sky, so it had nearly 1.25 million viewers, which is a 1.2 rating. Nitro drew 80,000 viewers while Thunder drew 60,000. The total universe for Sky is 4 million homes, while the universe of TNT Europe is 2.5 million homes, so that accounts for some of the huge discrepancy between the WWF and WCW numbers. But if you figure 1.5 viewers per home in England, that number could be high or low, but that's very close to the usual figure in the US. That would indicate Raw at a 6.7 rating. The lower numbers we've had are probably based on the entire population, most of which doesn't get the cable stations, I'm presuming, of available universe, and SmackDown at 4.0 while Nitro would be at a 2.1 and Thunder at a 1.6. Speaking of the UK, the TV show Big Breakfast, a Today Show-like morning talk show, had a poll for a rerun showing of their favorite guest of the year, and Angle won the poll, beating out Denzel Washington, Rob Schneider, Cisco, and the pop band All Saints. There is another case upcoming regarding a 12-year-old who allegedly assaulted an infant, with the WWF obsession defense apparently coming into play. SmackDown on August 15th in Worcester, Massachusetts drew a sellout 9,381, paying $291,890. August 19th in Greenville, South Carolina for the WWF's first event ever at the Ballot Center, they drew a sellout 14,936, paying $474,829. They did split crews on August 20th, with one crew in Baton Rouge, Louisiana drawing 6,488, paying $176,696, and second crew in Mobile, Alabama drawing 8,712, paying $243,412. Raw on August 21st in Lafayette, Louisiana drew a sellout 10,199, paying $319,877. Arena merchandise for the week was $327,273, or $6.58 per head, which is below what they had been doing. In Greenville, with no DX or Edge and Christian on the show, Rock beat Angle in the main event. Baton Rouge was headlined by Undertaker over Triple H. Mobile was also headlined by Rock over Angle. They are cutting down the number of wrestlers appearing on many of the house shows in order to keep the main players down to 15 house shows per month, while the company generally is doing a schedule of 18 dates per month. The Reader's Pages. Hall of Fame. What about Eddie Gilbert? Certainly he was a very good worker, having some great matches with Terry Funk, Mick Foley, and even Sabu. And except for maybe Eric Embry's run booking Memphis and Paul Heyman, Eddie's booking of Alabama in the late 80s was what the WWF has been doing for the past 3 years. Hall of Fame material? I believe so. Great matches. Big draw in several territories. Helped popularize all over the building brawling and did some of the best shoot angles in history. Johnny Ruggiero? Response from Dave Meltzer. I don't see Gilbert at that level. I was entertained by his booking in Alabama, but it wasn't sustained for any length of time, and he didn't have a track record of popping territories as a booker, and most of what he did was just stuff taken from Jerry Lawler's career in the 70s in Memphis. Most of his career when he was in major circuits he was mid-card. He was a very good worker, but never considered top 10 level, and had his own personal demons that usually resulted in not lasting long anywhere, and he passed away by the time he was 33. I don't think he could be called a big draw in any territory, although he was a very entertaining heel in the places he did headline. I think some of your comments regarding shoot-style fighting in the Untied States are way off the mark. You said Ken Shamrock didn't get your vote for the Hall of Fame because as shooting style gets less popular in the United States, his significance historically also diminishes. I'm not sure how you've come to the conclusion that MMA is less popular in the United States than last year. The ever-growing MMA scene has exploded this past year, with Jamie Levine's World Extreme Fighting and King of the Cage becoming major events. Pride has done very well on pay-per-view, and Rings has begun promoting in this country as well. On a weekly basis, more people are watching MMA than they were last year. I also can consider Dick Murdoch a serious Hall of Fame candidate. He was never a big star, and for much of his career was absolutely worthless inside the ring. Arn Anderson was a better worker, a better interview, and will be remembered by fans nationwide when Murdoch is completely forgotten. Jonathan Snowden. Athens, Georgia. Response from Dave Meltzer. While there are more live events, as it pertains to television visibility, MMA is not there as anything serious. When UFC was doing 250,000 buys, it was a major force. Pride coming in doing 10,000 buys or UFC doing 20,000 buys and nobody having prime-time television is hardly the level of popularity of something that's a major factor in this country right now. Having seen both in their primes, Paul Anderson is a better interviewer than Murdoch, and Anderson was a really good worker. In their primes, Murdoch was a better worker than Anderson and a bigger star in more places. Anderson will be remembered better by current fans because he came later and because he was a star, but never close to the major star in the company during the mid-80s NWA days as part of the Four Horsemen. Murdoch was also a far bigger star internationally than Anderson ever was domestically. I for one don't like a lot of people in. It makes the honor special. Mick Foley should be in without a doubt and is the #1 choice. He always gave the fans everything he had. Shawn Michaels was the leader of an exciting tag team early in his career. He was the most spectacular singles wrestler in the company for 4 to 5 years. Even his unprofessionalism shouldn't keep him out. Chris Benoit should be in. The past 6 months clinches it. I don't see Japanese wrestling but I can't imagine anyone better than him. Steve Austin shouldn't be in. In a different year, maybe. If he comes back for another year or 2 at the top, then yes. 8 years as a decent mid-card wrestler and 2.5 as the top guy isn't enough for me yet. Very hard decision, though. Arn Anderson is out. Love him. Want to vote for him, but can't. Owen Hart is out. Not as big a star as Bret. Would like to see a year-end award named for him through. Fabulous Moolah is in. I know the title never meant anything, but she held it forever. It has to mean something, even if I don't know what. I agree with your feelings on Lita. I'm a mid-30s conservative guy, not into dyed hair or tattoos or today's clothing. But there is something there I like. Charisma is a strange thing. You can't figure who will have it and she does. She needs to be kept in the 6-person matches with the Hardys. The more she stays away from the other women, except Stephanie and Chyna because they are big stars, the better. David Greenbeck. Response from Dave Meltzer. Isn't it funny that Lita has so much charisma but that Miss Congeniality in ECW had negative charisma? The Shawn Michaels Hall of Fame argument comes up frequently with Michaels' lack of professionalism cited as the reason for keeping him out. As a counter-argument, I'd like to mention 2 names, Dusty Rhodes and Bruiser Brody. Brody was a favorite of mine, but I'm sure you could fill up a 2-hour show telling stories about how he screwed up promotions by not only refusing to job, but refusing to sell, walking out of buildings, changing finishes in mid-match, quitting promotions in the middle of programs, etc. As for Rhodes, he didn't have to refuse to job because Dusty Rhodes the booker would never ask him to. He held the U.S. title, and booked himself getting stripped of it by hitting Jim Crockett with a bat. He held the TV title, and booked himself getting stripped of it after the Horsemen injured him. He dropped the national title in a first blood match when he wasn't even the first one to bleed. My favorite was when he lost the NWA title in 1979 because Terry Funk sneak attacked him and broke his arm 5 minutes before the rematch with Harley Race. The promotion begged him to postpone the match, but St. Dusty would have none of that. I have more examples, but I'm sure we all get the point. I'm in no way arguing that Rhodes and Brody don't belong in the Hall of Fame, but it seems Michaels is being held to a different standard. John McAdam. The Hall of Fame candidates have brought up many opinions. I agree with you on some, but my definition of a wrestler varies. A wrestler to me is someone with athletic ability, charisma, personality, and can draw heat. Steve Austin has yet to show me any ability. Dirty talk doesn't make a wrestler. In the ring all I've seen him do is stomp, kick, punch and drink beer. It's the Angelo Mosca/King Kong Bundy genre to me. The only difference is more exposure, more vulgarity and the fans marking out for him. If Austin and Dwayne Johnson didn't cuss consistently and run wild over authority, they would be as big stars as Paul Jones and Manny Fernandez were. The Andersons and Freebirds are legends in the tag team division. Personally, I feel Ole Anderson qualifies as an individual as he formed tag teams with Lars Anderson, Gene Anderson, Arn Anderson, Ivan Koloff and Stan Hansen, so it shows he can mesh with the best wrestlers or so-so wrestlers. His interviews were incredible, and much like Michael Hayes, he knew how to do interviews that drew a crowd. Chris Benoit, Hiroho Kudo and Bull Nakano should all be in. Bob Backlund, Conan, Masahiro Chono, Wahoo McDaniel, Pedro Morales, Sabu and Ken Shamrock. I agree with your viewpoints on all of them. Shawn Michaels was great as part of the Rockers and an incredible worker as WWF champion. But longevity and attitude make me say no. Jimmy Snuka was awesome in Mid-Atlantic. His team with Paul Orndorff was good and his team with Ray Stevens was what made him a star. Feuding with Ric Flair, Ricky Steamboat, Jay Youngblood and Masked Superstar words can't even describe. I would squeak him in. Bobby Yates. Randleman, North Carolina. Foley. I first had the opportunity to see the already legendary Gordon Foley host Championship Wrestling from Florida in 1971 when I was working at a radio station in Albany, Georgia. Watching Atlanta wrestling on TV was something I had enjoyed doing since the early 50s, but since I had always wanted to get into broadcasting from the time I was 6 years old, I found that I paid as much attention to the announcers as I did to the wrestlers. Ed Capral was a very competent wrestling announcer, but wrestling for him was primarily an opportunity to get out of the daily grind of television and open up a successful advertising agency. Freddie Miller was an Atlanta TV staple. Wrestling allowed him to stay on TV when his other avenues dried up. Gordon Foley, on the other hand, loved the wrestling business, and it showed in his work. While he didn't have the classic broadcast quality voice, he made up for it by doing his homework, and insisting on doing his absolute best every time he went on the air, no matter what personal or physical problems faced him that day. I knew Gordon only professionally during the 4 years that I worked as the ring announcer for Georgia Championship Wrestling from the old Channel 17 studios. I was also writing occasional articles for Wrestling News, and one day I got up enough nerve to ask Gordon if he would consider allowing me to interview him for a story. To my surprise, he eagerly said yes, and we spent about 45 minutes talking about his career and his thoughts on the business. I was surprised to find out that Gordon had been a stock car race announcer and a DJ in his early broadcasting days. He gave me a piece of advice: only work for NWA Promotions. We never had another real conversation, as I was forced out of my position shortly after that, but I got word that Gordon really enjoyed the story in print. Two memories that I will always have of Gordon Foley are, unfortunately, the ever-present cigarette in one hand and, fortunately, the microphone in the other hand. Jay West. Morrow, Georgia. Whether it's the clash of titans in the ring or the drama that unfolds outside it, we're here to break it down, match by match, feud by feud. Remember, in the world of wrestling, every day is a battle, and every victory is a story waiting to be told. Until next time, keep the passion alive, and never stop wrestling with the possibilities. This is the Pro Wrestle Machine,